Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey back to a time when Monday morning did not mean traffic jams or alarm clocks. It meant something far more terrifying. Picture this: a woman waking up at 4 in the morning not to catch a flight, but to face 12 hours of back-breaking labour that would leave her hands bleeding, her back aching and her spirit wondering if she could survive another week. This was not war. This was not famine. This was simply laundry day. And before you think you know this story, let me tell you, what American women endured every single Monday would make our hardest work days look like a vacation. So before we step back into those exhausting Mondays together, I have a small request. If you find yourself drawn into these stories, if you feel that connection to the past, would you consider subscribing to the channel? A like on this video would mean the world to me, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we are exploring together. And I am curious, where are you right now? Are you in bed in California, on a night shift in New York, watching from across the ocean? Drop a comment and let me know when and where you started this journey with me. Your presence here matters. Now, dim those lights if you can, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, get comfortable, and let us walk together through the world of American women before washing machines changed everything. Let me take you back to a Saturday evening in rural Pennsylvania, sometime in the 1880s. The sun is setting, and inside a modest farmhouse, a woman named Sarah is not resting after a long week. She cannot rest, because tomorrow is Sunday, and the day after that, well, the day after that is Monday. And in homes across America, from the farms of Iowa to the townhouses of Boston, women everywhere are doing exactly what Sarah is doing right now. They're preparing for battle. Sarah moves through her home, gathering every piece of dirty clothing she can find. Her husband's work shirts, stiff with sweat and soil. Her children's dresses and trousers, stained with the mud and grass and 1,000 childhood adventures. The bedsheets that have not been washed in 2 weeks because, well, honestly, who has the strength to wash them every week? The kitchen towels, the undergarments, the handkerchiefs. Everything goes into piles on the floor of her small bedroom. And here is something that might surprise you. Sarah is not just collecting laundry. She is inspecting every single item like a surgeon examining a patient. Because in her world, in this time before washing machines, before convenient 24-hour laundromats, every rip, every tear, every loose button is a problem that must be solved now, not Monday, now. She lights an oil lamp as darkness falls, and she sits down with her sewing basket. For the next 2 or 3 hours, Sarah will mend. She will darn socks with holes in them, because buying new socks is expensive and waste is simply not an option when your family lives on the edge of financial survival. She will sew up the tear in her son's trousers where he caught them on a fence. She will reattach buttons. She will reinforce seams that are starting to give way. Why is she doing this? Because come Monday morning, when she plunges these clothes into boiling water and scrubs them against a washboard with all her might, any weak spots will simply rip apart. And then what? Then she has wasted her time, wasted her soap, and still has torn clothes that need replacing. So Saturday night is mending night. Always. But Sarah is one of the fortunate ones. She has a sewing basket with needles and thread. She has a lamp with enough oil to see by. Some women, particularly newly freed black women in the South during Reconstruction, are doing this same work by firelight, using needles they have owned for years, thread they have carefully saved and reused until it is almost too thin to work with. Yet they persist, because Monday is coming whether they are ready or not. Sunday morning arrives, and after church, after the big Sunday meal that is meant to provide leftovers for Monday when there will be no time to cook properly, Sarah begins the next phase of preparation. She fills her largest wooden tub with water. Not hot water, not yet, just lukewarm water from the pump outside. Trip after trip she carries buckets, filling this tub until it is deep enough to submerge the dirtiest items. She adds a bit of soap, just a little. Soap is precious. If she made it herself from wood ash and rendered animal fat, then she knows exactly how much labour went into every single bar. If she bought it from the general store, then she knows exactly how much of her family's limited money it cost. Either way, soap is not something you waste. The dirtiest items go into this tub: work clothes, the shirts and trousers that have absorbed a week's worth of farm labour or factory work. These will soak overnight, all through Sunday evening and into Monday morning, giving the water and soap time to loosen the ground-in dirt, the sweat, the stains that no amount of immediate scrubbing could remove. And then Sarah goes to bed. But I want you to understand something about her sleep that night. It is not peaceful. It is not the sleep of someone looking forward to a day off, a lazy Monday of reading or visiting friends. No, Sarah sleeps the way a soldier might sleep the night before battle, restlessly, anxiously, because she knows what Monday morning holds. The alarm in Sarah's mind goes off somewhere around 4 or 4:30 in the morning, no actual alarm clock needed. Her body knows. Every woman's body knows. Monday has arrived. She gets up in the darkness and immediately begins to work. First, she needs fire. Lots of fire. She goes outside to the wood pile and she begins carrying armload after armload of wood. If her husband or sons are around, they might help with this part. But often they have their own work to do, their own fields to plough or their own jobs to get to, so Sarah carries the wood herself. She builds up the fire in her stove or in an outdoor fire pit, depending on the season. In summer, many women do their wash outside because heating up the house with fire and boiling water when it is already 80 or 90 degrees outside is a form of torture that only Monday can demand. In winter, they have no choice but to work inside, where at least the heat serves a dual purpose. While the fire gets going, Sarah returns to the task she dreads most, hauling water. And this is where the real torture of Monday begins. Because laundry does not take a bucket or two of water. It takes dozens, 50 gallons, 60 gallons, sometimes more, depending on how much laundry has accumulated and how large her family is. Every single gallon weighs more than 8 pounds. Do the math with me for a moment. 50 gallons times 8 pounds equals 400 pounds of water. 400 pounds that Sarah will carry bucket by bucket from whatever source she has available. If she is lucky, there is a pump in her yard, maybe 30 or 40 feet from her workspace. If she is less fortunate, she is walking to a neighbour's pump or to a stream that might be 100 yards away or more. Back and forth, her arms straining, her back beginning to ache before the actual washing has even begun. And all of this while the sky is still dark, while the rest of the world is sleeping, while her own children are still in their beds, unaware that their mother has already been working for an hour or more. By the time the sun starts to rise, Sarah has water heating in every vessel she owns. A large pot on the stove, a kettle, perhaps a copper boiler if she has one. The water must get hot, not warm, hot. Because the washing process requires genuinely hot water to do any good at all, and the boiling process that comes later requires water that is, well, boiling. And here is where we need to pause and recognize something that our modern minds might not fully grasp. Sarah cannot turn a knob and have hot water. She cannot adjust a thermostat. Every degree of heat in that water represents wood she carried, fire she built and maintained, time she spent waiting for physics to do its work. Water does not boil quickly over a wood fire. It takes time, so much time. While she waits, Sarah drags out the tub she soaked clothes in last night. The water is cold now, greyish from the dirt that has leached out overnight. She drains this water, carrying it bucket by bucket to dump outside. Then she begins the process of setting up her workspace. She needs at least 3 tubs, one for washing, one for the first rinse, one for the second rinse. If she has a 4th tub, that is a luxury that makes the day slightly less hellish, because she can use it for bluing or starching, but 3 is the minimum. 3 large, heavy, unwieldy tubs that she has to position just right so that she can move from one to the next without too much wasted motion. Let us stop here and think about the women who watched their mothers do this, who knew from childhood that this would be their future. In 1807, a woman named Rachel Haskell wrote in her diary about Laundry Day. She called it, and I am quoting directly here, the Herculean task which women all dread, and the great domestic dread of the household. Herculean. She compared it to the labours of Hercules, the mythological hero who had to complete 12 impossible tasks. And you know what? She was not exaggerating. Because what Sarah is about to do, what millions of American women did every single Monday for decades, was genuinely heroic in its difficulty. Picture Sarah now standing in front of her 3 tubs, her fire burning hot, her water finely heated. It is maybe 6 or 7 in the morning. She has been up for 2 or 3 hours already. She has not eaten breakfast yet. There is no time. The work must be done while the light is good, while the day is still ahead of her. She takes the first item from her pile of soaking clothes. Let us say it is her husband's work shirt. She plunges it into the tub of hot soapy water, and then she begins to scrub. She scrubs it against a washboard, that ridged piece of metal or glass set in a wooden frame. Back and forth, using every ounce of strength in her arms to force the fabric against those ridges, to force the dirt out through sheer mechanical action and friction. Her hands are already sore. The soap is harsh. If she made it herself, it is basically lye, a caustic substance that burns skin. Even store-bought soap in this era is nothing like our gentle, moisturizing hand soaps today. This stuff is meant to cut through dirt and grease, and it does not care if it cuts through skin in the process. Sarah scrubs and scrubs. When she thinks one side is clean, she flips the shirt and scrubs the other side. This is not optional. The domestic advice manuals of the time are very clear. Both sides of every garment must be washed thoroughly. Every seam, every fold, every inch of fabric. How long does it take to wash one shirt? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Multiply that by every shirt, every dress, every pair of trousers, every pillowcase, every towel, every single item in that massive pile of laundry. We are talking hours. Just the scrubbing alone takes hours, but we are not even close to done. Because after scrubbing, many items need to be boiled, especially white items, especially undergarments and bed linens. These go into the big pot or copper boiler filled with soapy water. Sarah must lift these heavy wet items and transfer them into boiling water. Then she must stand there in the heat and steam, stirring them with a long wooden stick, making sure they do not scorch on the bottom of the pot, making sure they boil evenly, making sure the agitation of the water and the heat and the soap combine to actually get them clean. 30 minutes. At least 30 minutes of boiling, the domestic manuals say. Some say an hour for very dirty items. Imagine standing over a pot of boiling water in July. Imagine the heat rising into your face, the sweat running down your back, the exhaustion settling into your bones. And remember, Sarah still has not eaten breakfast. She probably will not eat a proper meal until well into the afternoon, if then, because stopping means losing daylight, losing heat from the fire, losing momentum, so she keeps going. The comparisons to our modern experience almost feel cruel to make. Today I can take a basket of dirty laundry, dump it into a machine, add some detergent, press a button and walk away. 30 minutes later I come back to clean clothes. Maybe I spent 3 minutes of actual labour on the entire process. Sarah has been working for 5 or 6 hours now, and she is maybe halfway through the washing portion of laundry day. She has not even started rinsing yet. She has not wrung anything out properly. She has not hung anything to dry. She has not thought about the ironing that will consume all of Tuesday. And here is the thing that breaks my heart every time I think about it. Sarah will do this again next Monday, and the Monday after that, and the Monday after that, for her entire adult life. 52 Mondays a year, minus maybe a week or two when she is too sick or has just given birth. That is roughly 50 Mondays every single year of back-breaking, exhausting, soul-crushing labour. Let me put this in perspective with some numbers that might shock you. Historians who have studied this estimate that a full laundry day took between 8 and 12 hours of continuous work. Let us average that to 10 hours. 50 Mondays a year times 10 hours equals 500 hours per year. That is the equivalent of more than 12 full-time work weeks every single year, doing nothing but laundry. And we have not even talked about all the other housework yet. The cooking on that same Monday, the childcare, the endless other tasks that did not stop just because it was laundry day. But I want to end this part of our journey with a story that gives me hope, that reminds me why understanding this history matters. There was a community of women in the rural Midwest, in cheese factory towns, who got so tired of Mondays that they organised. They created laundry cooperatives. They convinced the cheese factories to let them use the facilities and the hot water for washing their families' clothes together. Think about that. These women, exhausted and desperate, found a way to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. They supported each other. They shared the labor. They refused to suffer alone. That spirit, that refusal to simply accept that this is how it must be, that determination to find a better way, that is what eventually led to change. Not immediately, not quickly, but eventually. We have so much more to explore about how women survived this era. We have barely touched on the actual techniques, the dangers, the class divisions, the racial inequalities, the inventions that half worked, the commercial laundries that offered brief hope, and the eventual revolution that changed everything. But first, we need to understand something else. We need to talk about the water itself. Because before Sarah could even start washing, before she could scrub or boil or rinse, she had to haul every single drop of water she used. And that story, the story of water, is where we need to go next. Because the invisible labour of hauling water was the foundation on which all of this exhausting work was built. And when we truly understand what it meant to haul 50 or 60 gallons of water by hand, we start to understand why women's backs broke, why their bodies gave out decades before their time, why this was not just hard work, but work that quite literally shortened lives. So let us pause here for tonight's rest. Close your eyes if you have not already. Let the weight of what Sarah experienced settle gently over you. Tomorrow, when you do your laundry, when you press that button and walk away, remember her. Remember the Monday she is still living in our past. And when you are ready, we will continue. We will talk about water, about the labour that no one saw, the work that history almost forgot, sweet dreams, water. We turn on a tap and there it is. Hot, cold, whatever we need, whenever we need it. We fill a glass, we take a shower, we run a dishwasher, and we never once think about where that water came from or how it arrived in our homes. But I want you to imagine something with me right now. Imagine that every single drop of water you will use tomorrow, you have to carry by hand, in buckets, from somewhere outside your home. How would that change your life? How would that change everything? Let me introduce you to Mary O'Brien. She is a young Irish immigrant living in New York City in 1875. She is not Sarah from Pennsylvania. Mary's world is different, urban, crowded. But in one crucial way, Mary's Monday is exactly the same as Sarah's. She has to get water, lots of it. And there is no tap in her tenement apartment. There is barely a window that opens. Mary lives on the 4th floor of a building that houses 12 families. At 5 in the morning every Monday, she makes her way down 4 flights of narrow, dark stairs carrying 2 wooden buckets. At the bottom, in the courtyard shared by all the tenement buildings on her block, there is a pump. One pump for maybe 100 people. And Mary is not the only woman who had the idea to start early. There is already a line, 3 women ahead of her, all with the same exhausted look on their faces, all with the same buckets, all facing the same Herculean task. How long will Mary wait? Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20 if the pump is slow or if someone ahead of her needs extra water for some reason. When her turn finally comes, Mary begins pumping. The handle is stiff. It takes real force to move it up and down, up and down. Water comes out in spurts, splashing into her bucket. One bucket takes maybe 5 minutes to fill if she is lucky and the pump is working well. Then the second bucket, another 5 minutes. Now Mary has 2 full buckets. Do you know how much 2 buckets of water weigh? Let us say each bucket holds about 2.5 gallons. That is 20 pounds per bucket. 40 pounds total. Mary now has to carry 40 pounds of water up 4 flights of stairs in the dark, on stairs that are uneven and slippery and possibly icy if it's winter. She makes it to her tiny apartment, she pours the water into a large tub, and then she goes back down, because 2 buckets, 5 gallons, is nowhere near enough. She will make this trip 15 times, 20 times, maybe more. Before her laundry day even truly begins, Mary will have climbed those stairs 30 or 40 times, carrying 40 pounds each trip. Let me do the math for you. 20 trips up the stairs, carrying 40 pounds each time, equals 800 pounds of water carried up 4 flights of stairs before breakfast. 800 pounds. That is the weight of a grand piano. Mary is essentially carrying a piano up the stairs, bucket by bucket, just to have enough water to wash clothes. And here is the part that makes me want to cry every time I think about it. Mary is one of the lucky ones. She has a pump in her courtyard. It might be contaminated, it might make people sick, but at least it is there. At least she does not have to walk 3 blocks to the nearest public pump. At least she does not have to fight with women from other buildings for access. Let us go back to rural America now. Let me tell you about Elizabeth, a farmer's wife in Kansas in 1890. Elizabeth's nearest water source is a well about 60 feet from her house. Not too far, you might think. Just a short walk. But that well is 30 feet deep and she has to lower a bucket on a rope, let it fill, then haul it back up by hand. Lowering a bucket is easy. Raising a bucket full of water from 30 feet down is not easy at all. It is an upper body workout that would challenge most of us today, and Elizabeth does this over and over and over. Drop the bucket, wait for it to fill, haul it up, pour it into her carrying buckets, drop the bucket again. On really cold winter mornings, the rope is stiff and rough on her hands. Sometimes there is ice forming on the surface of the well water. Elizabeth's hands are already chapped from everything else she does, and now she is gripping a rough rope and hauling weight that strains every muscle in her arms and shoulders and back. But at least Elizabeth has a well on her property. Some women have to walk much farther. I found a memoir from a woman in Montana who described walking 1/4 mile to a stream, filling her buckets, and walking back. 1/4 mile does not sound like much until you're carrying 40 or 50 pounds. Then it becomes an eternity. And we need to talk about what happened in summer versus winter, because the challenges were completely different but equally brutal. In summer, water sources could dry up. Wells that worked fine in spring might be nearly empty by August. Streams might slow to a trickle. Women had to walk farther, dig deeper, work harder to find water. In winter, everything froze. The pump in Mary's courtyard in New York? It could freeze solid. Women would have to pour hot water over it just to get it working, which meant they needed to have hot water to begin with, which meant they needed to have gotten water previously, which meant they had to plan ahead in ways that feel almost impossibly complex. Elizabeth's well in Kansas could develop ice on top. She would have to break through the ice first, then lower her bucket into the frigid water below. I have read accounts of women whose hands became so cold during this process that they could barely feel the rope, could barely grip it. Yet they had to keep going because their families needed water. And here is something that will shock you. Water was not just heavy, it was dangerous. Women fell. They slipped on icy stairs or muddy paths. They dropped buckets that hit their feet or legs. They strained their backs so badly that they lived with chronic pain for the rest of their lives. There are death records from this era, listing causes of death as falls while carrying water or injuries sustained from well accidents. Let me share a specific story that I came across in my research. A woman named Anna Schmidt, living in rural Wisconsin in 1888, was carrying 2 buckets of water from her well when she slipped on a patch of ice. She fell hard and one of the buckets landed on her leg, fracturing it. In our modern world, that would be painful but manageable. A trip to the emergency room, a cast, some pain medication, and eventually a full recovery. But Anna lived in an era before easy access to doctors, before antibiotics, before modern orthopedic care. Her broken leg became infected. She spent 3 months bedridden, unable to do her work, dependent on neighbours and family for help. She survived, but she walked with a limp for the rest of her life. And the truly heartbreaking part? She was back to carrying water as soon as she could walk again, because there was no other choice. Now, let us talk about something that I think gets overlooked in most histories of this time. The water that women hauled was not always clean. In fact, it was often decidedly unclean. City pumps drew from underground sources that were frequently contaminated with sewage. Rural wells could be polluted by animal waste or runoff from farms. Streams and rivers were used for all sorts of purposes, including dumping waste. Women knew this. They could often smell it or taste it, but what choice did they have? You cannot wash clothes without water. You cannot cook without water. You cannot survive without water. So they used what they had access to and they hoped for the best. And sometimes the best was not good enough. Cholera outbreaks, typhoid fever, dysentery, all of these were directly linked to contaminated water. Women would unknowingly use tainted water to wash clothes, to cook food, to give to their children. The connection between water and disease was not fully understood yet, not in the way we understand it now. I want you to think about a typical Monday morning in 1880s America from a water perspective. Let us go back to Sarah in Pennsylvania. By the time she is ready to actually start washing clothes, she has already hauled perhaps 50 to 60 gallons of water. That is 400 to 500 pounds. And remember, she did not haul it all at once. She made trip after trip after trip. How long did this take? An hour at minimum, more likely 2 hours, before she even begins the washing process. Before she scrubs a single shirt, Sarah has already worked for 2 hours doing nothing but hauling water and heating it over the fire she built and maintained. And here is the cruelest irony of all. After she finishes washing, after she has scrubbed and boiled and rinsed everything, Sarah has to get rid of all that water. 50 or 60 gallons of now dirty, soapy water has to be carried away and dumped. More trips, more carrying, more strain on her already exhausted body. Can you imagine? If someone told you today that you had to carry away 60 gallons of dirty water bucket by bucket, where would you even put it? Sarah probably dumped it in her yard or in a drainage ditch or in a spot far enough from the house that it would not create mud and smell. But she had to carry it there, every drop. Let me share some numbers that put this in perspective. Historians who have studied household labour in the 19th century estimate that American women spent between 10 and 20 hours per week just on water-related tasks, not cooking with water, not washing with water, just getting the water, heating the water, and disposing of the water. 20 hours a week equals more than 1,000 hours per year. If you worked a full-time job, that would be 6 months of work every single year, doing nothing but water management. Think about that. 6 months of your life every year spent hauling buckets. And this was not evenly distributed across society. Wealthy women did not haul their own water. They had servants for that, but those servants, almost always women, often immigrants or black women in the South, they were the ones whose backs broke. They were the ones who climbed stairs and walked to wells and pumped until their arms ached. There is a particular cruelty to invisible labour, is there not? The work that nobody sees, nobody acknowledges, nobody values. When we look at old photographs from this era, we see women in their long dresses and aprons, and they often look stoic, calm, composed. But we do not see their chronic back pain. We do not see their damaged hands. We do not see the years taken off their lives by sheer physical exhaustion. I found a letter written in 1895 by a woman named Martha, living in rural Virginia. She was writing to her sister who had moved to a city that had just gotten running water in some buildings. Martha wrote, and I am quoting here, "I cannot imagine what it must be like to have water come into your house as if by magic. Some days I dream about it. I dream that I turn a handle and water appears, warm and clean, and I can wash anything I want without first walking and carrying and lifting and aching. Is it truly like that, sister? Or are you teasing me with fairy tales? Does that not break your heart?" This woman could barely believe that running water was real. It sounded like a fairy tale to her. And the saddest part? Running water existed in some parts of America by 1895, but it would be decades before it reached rural areas. Martha probably hauled water for the rest of her life. Now let me tell you about the women who found small ways to rebel against this crushing burden. Some women, particularly in farming communities, would save rainwater. They would set out every barrel, bucket and tub they owned when a storm was coming, trying to catch as much rainwater as possible. Rainwater was softer than well water, better for washing, and it required no hauling from a well. But this was unpredictable. You could not control when it rained. And if you were in the middle of a drought, if weeks went by without rain, then you were back to the well, back to the stream, back to the endless carrying. There were also women who would schedule their laundry days based on weather. Not just because you needed good drying weather for the clothes, but because doing laundry on a cool day was more bearable than doing it when it was 90 degrees outside. But again, this was a luxury that not everyone could afford. If you worked outside the home, if you had a job in a factory or as a domestic servant, you did laundry when you had time off, regardless of weather. Let us talk about the physical toll more specifically, because I think we need to really understand what this did to women's bodies. Carrying heavy weights repeatedly causes what we now call repetitive strain injuries. The shoulders, the back, the hips, all of these joints wear down faster when subjected to constant heavy lifting. Medical records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show that women, particularly working class women, had much higher rates of back problems, joint pain, and what was then called general debility, which basically meant their bodies were just worn out. They were exhausted at a cellular level. And remember, this was in an era before physical therapy, before effective pain medication, before we understood how to treat chronic pain. If your back went out from hauling too much water, you basically just had to live with it. Maybe you could rest for a day or two if you were lucky. But more often you kept working because there was no alternative. I think about these women sometimes when I'm at the gym, watching people carefully lift weights with perfect form, taking breaks between sets, drinking protein shakes and stretching. And I think about how women in the 1800s were doing strength training that would put most of us to shame, but they were getting none of the benefits and all of the damage because they had no choice but to keep going day after day after day. Here is a question I want you to consider. Why do we not talk about this more? Why is the story of hauling water, this fundamental, exhausting, body-destroying labour, so absent from our history books? I think it is because it was women's work. And women's work, especially the hardest and most physical parts of it, has always been somehow invisible in the historical record. We learn about men building railroads and canals. We learn about the back-breaking labour of coal miners and steel workers. And yes, that work was brutal and deserves recognition. But we skip over the fact that women were also doing back-breaking labour every single day, just to maintain a household, just to keep their families clean and fed. The water they hauled was the foundation of everything. You cannot cook without water. You cannot wash without water. You cannot survive without water. So women hauled it, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, and history barely noticed. But their bodies noticed. Oh, their bodies noticed. And if we look closely at the evidence that remains, we can see it. We can see it in the medical records, in the letters, in the memoirs of women who finally, in their old age, had time to write down what their lives had been like. One more story before we move forward. I want to tell you about a community of black laundresses in Atlanta, Georgia in the 1880s. These women, many of them formerly enslaved, were taking in washing from white families to earn money. They were already doing the hardest work, washing other people's dirty clothes, and they were also hauling every drop of water they needed. In 1881, these women organized a strike. They formed the Washing Society and demanded better pay. But what I find fascinating is that in their list of demands, they mentioned the physical toll of the work. They talked about how hauling water and washing clothes was destroying their health. They wanted to be paid enough to make the suffering worthwhile. Did they win everything they asked for? No, but they fought. They organized. They made their invisible labor visible, even if only for a moment. And that matters. That resistance matters. So now we have seen women hauling water in cities and on farms. We have seen them slip and fall and hurt themselves. We have seen them use contaminated water because they had no choice. We have seen the years of their lives consumed by this single task. But water was only the beginning, because once they had the water, once they had hauled and heated and prepared it, then came the next battle, the fire, the flames that had to be built and maintained and controlled for hours and hours, the heat that turned a laundry day into something that felt like working in a furnace. And that is where we need to turn our attention next. Because understanding fire management in the 1800s means understanding yet another layer of skill and danger and exhausting labour that women had to master just to get through a Monday. Have you ever had to restart a fire that went out? Maybe you were camping and the wind blew out your campfire and you had to spend 20 frustrating minutes getting it going again. Now imagine that fire is not for fun. It is not for roasting marshmallows or staying warm on a cool evening. It is the difference between eating or not eating, between having clean clothes or not having clean clothes, between surviving winter or freezing. That fire is everything, and it is your job to keep it alive. Welcome to the world of fire management in 19th century America, and I promise you this was an art form that would challenge even the most capable person today. Because we are not just talking about lighting a fire. We are talking about creating different temperatures for different purposes, maintaining heat for 10 or 12 hours straight, doing all of this safely while children run around the house, and somehow not burning the entire place down in the process. Let me introduce you to Catherine Walsh. She lives in a small town in Vermont in 1873. It is Monday morning, naturally, and Catherine has just finished hauling water. Now comes the part that will determine whether her entire day succeeds or fails. She needs fire, lots of it, at different temperatures, and she needs it to last. Catherine goes outside to her woodshed. If she is fortunate, her husband or sons chopped wood over the weekend. If she is less fortunate, well, she is about to add wood chopping to her list of Monday morning tasks. Because you cannot have fire without fuel. And in 1873 Vermont, fuel means wood. Lots and lots of wood. How much wood are we talking about? A woman doing a full day of laundry with cooking and water heating needed approximately 50 pounds of wood. 50 pounds, that is like carrying a 7-year-old child. But of course you cannot carry it all at once. So Catherine makes trip after trip from the woodshed to her kitchen, building up a pile of wood that will last her through the day. And here is where it gets complicated. Not all wood is the same, and Catherine knows this. Every woman who managed a household fire knew this. Softwoods like pine light easily but burn fast and hot. Good for getting a fire started quickly, not so good for maintaining a steady temperature for hours. Hardwoods like oak or maple burn slower and more evenly, but they are harder to light and they take longer to get hot. So Catherine's strategy, like that of millions of women before her, is to start with kindling and softwood to get the fire going, then gradually add hardwoods to maintain it. This is not something you can do carelessly. This requires attention, skill and experience. Too much softwood and you waste fuel. Too much hardwood too early and the fire never gets hot enough. Let me paint you a picture of Catherine's morning now. It is maybe 5:30 or 6 in the morning. She has been up for over an hour, she has hauled water, she has brought in wood. Now she kneels in front of her cast iron stove, or perhaps in front of an outdoor fire pit if it is summer, and she begins the delicate process of building a fire. First, she needs to clean out yesterday's ashes, or maybe Saturday's ashes if she was smart enough to do this prep work over the weekend. She scoops them out carefully into a bucket. This is not a quick task. There are a lot of ashes, and if she is not careful, ash dust flies everywhere, coating everything in a fine grey powder that will just mean more cleaning later. The ashes go into an ash bucket, which will eventually be dumped outside. But interestingly, women did not waste ashes. Those ashes had value. Remember that homemade soap I mentioned earlier? Wood ash is a key ingredient in making lye, which is a key ingredient in making soap. So Catherine will save some of these ashes for soap making later. Now the stove is clean, or clean enough. Catherine lays down a foundation of crumpled newspaper if she has any, or dry leaves or corn husks, anything that will catch fire easily. On top of this, she arranges small pieces of kindling in a careful pattern that allows air to flow through. Air is crucial. Fire needs oxygen. Too much and it burns too fast. Too little and it goes out. She strikes a match. In our world, this is nothing. We flick a lighter or strike a match and barely think about it. But matches in Catherine's world are not unlimited. They cost money. A box of matches is a household expense that must be budgeted for. So when Catherine strikes that match, she is hoping, praying really, that her fire-building skills are good enough that it will catch on the first tray. The kindling catches. Small flames lick upward. Catherine watches carefully, adding slightly larger pieces of wood. Just the right. Too soon and she smothers the fire. Too late and it dies out. This is the art of it. The skill that women learned from their mothers and grandmothers, passed down through generations. As the fire grows, Catherine begins adding the real fuel. Pieces of split wood carefully chosen for size and type. She is building toward a specific goal. She needs enough heat to boil water, which means she needs the fire hot. But she also needs it to last for hours, which means she cannot let it burn too fast. And here is something that I think would absolutely exhaust us if we had to do it. Catherine cannot just build this fire and walk away. She has to tend it, constantly. For the next 10 or 12 hours, Catherine will be monitoring this fire, adjusting it, adding fuel, managing the dampers and flues if she has a stove, making sure it stays at the right temperature for whatever task she is doing at that moment. Do you know how much attention that requires? Imagine trying to work on something important while also checking on a fire every 10 or 15 minutes, all day long. It is like trying to focus on a complex task while your phone buzzes with notifications constantly, except you cannot turn off the notifications because if you do, your fire dies and your entire day is ruined. Let me tell you about the dampers and flues because this is where fire management became almost scientific in its complexity. A cast iron stove, which became common in American homes by the mid-1800s, had a series of dampers and flues that controlled airflow. Open a damper and the fire gets more oxygen, burning hotter and faster. Close it and the fire slows down. Sounds simple, right? Except there were usually multiple dampers, one for the main firebox, one for the oven if the stove had an oven, one for the stovetop. And they all interacted with each other in ways that were not always predictable. A woman had to learn through experience how adjusting one damper affected the others, how wind direction outside changed the draft, how the type of wood she was burning altered everything. There is a wonderful, slightly exasperated quote from a domestic advice manual from 1869, written by Catherine Beecher and her sister Harriet Beecher Stowe. They wrote, "The management of a cooking stove is an art which every young woman should learn." An art. They called it an art. Because it was not just a simple mechanical task, it required judgment, experience, and constant attention. Now let us talk about what happens when fire management goes wrong, because it went wrong more often than you might think. First, there is the problem of a fire that goes out. Maybe you got distracted by a crying child or by some other household emergency. Maybe you misjudged the wood and it burned too fast. Maybe a gust of wind blew down the chimney at just the wrong moment. Whatever the reason, your fire is now dead or dying. In our modern world, this is annoying but fixable. We relight it and move on. But for Catherine, this is a disaster. She has water that needs boiling. She has clothes that need washing. She has a schedule that depends on having hot water available. If her fire dies, she has to start the entire process over again. Building the fire, waiting for it to get hot, heating water from scratch, she might lose an hour or two. On a day that is already going to take 12 hours, losing 2 more is almost unbearable. Then there is the opposite problem, a fire that gets too hot. This might sound like less of an issue, but it was actually quite dangerous. An overly hot fire could crack a cast iron stove, and replacing a stove was a major expense, sometimes costing more than a month's wages. So women had to be careful not to overheat their stoves. But beyond the cost, an overly hot fire was a burn hazard. Women in long skirts working near open flames or very hot stoves were constantly at risk. Their clothing could catch fire. I found records of women who died from burns sustained when their skirts brushed against a stove or an open fire pit. This was not rare. This was a known danger that every woman lived with. Let me share a specific story. In 1881, a woman named Rebecca Johnson was doing her laundry at her home in rural Ohio. She was stirring a pot of boiling clothes over an open fire when a gust of wind blew her skirt into the flames. Her dress, made of cotton and completely dry from the summer heat, caught fire immediately. Rebecca panicked and ran, which made the fire worse. Her husband heard her screams and managed to put out the flames, but not before she had sustained burns over much of her body. She survived, but she spent months recovering, and she bore the scars for the rest of her life. Stories like this were tragically common. Women worked around fire all day, every day. The odds were not in their favour. Eventually something would go wrong. Maybe they would be lucky, and it would just be a small burn, a singe, a scare. Or maybe they would not be lucky. And we have not even talked about the heat itself. Not the danger of burning, but the simple oppressive heat of working next to a fire for 12 hours. Imagine it is July in Tennessee. The temperature outside is 95 degrees with humidity that makes the air feel thick enough to cut with a knife. Now imagine standing next to a fire hot enough to boil water. For hours, with no air conditioning, no fan, just the relentless heat. Women describe this as torture. Literal torture. There are diary entries and letters where women wrote about how they dreaded summer laundry days more than almost anything else. One woman in Mississippi wrote in 1888, "I would rather work in the fields under the sun than do washing in July. At least in the fields there is sometimes a breeze. Beside the fire there is only heat and more heat until I feel I might faint." But they did not faint. Or if they did, they got up and kept working because the clothes still needed washing. The fire still needed tending. The work did not stop just because the heat was unbearable. Now let us talk about fuel costs and logistics, because this was yet another burden. Wood was not free, even if you lived in a rural area with trees around. Someone had to cut it, split it, stack it, and bring it in. If you lived in a city, you had to buy wood or coal, and the cost was significant. In the 1890s, a typical urban family spent about £292 of coal per week just on cooking and heating water. At the prices of the time, that was a noticeable portion of a working family's budget. And remember, this is every week, 52 weeks a year. The cost added up. For families on the edge of poverty, this was a real crisis. Do you spend money on fuel so you can cook and wash clothes, or do you spend that money on food? Some families literally had to make that choice. And when they chose fuel, it meant less food on the table. When they chose food, it meant wearing dirty clothes or eating cold meals. There were also women who used alternative fuels out of desperation. On the prairie, where trees were scarce, women burned dried buffalo dung, corn cobs, twisted hay, anything that would burn. These fuels were less efficient than wood, produced more smoke, and were generally unpleasant to work with. But they were free, and free mattered more than pleasant. One prairie woman wrote about gathering buffalo chips with her children. She described it as humiliating work, something she never imagined she would do when she was growing up back east. But there she was, on the Kansas prairie, gathering dried dung to fuel her stove because there was no other choice. Pride, she wrote, was a luxury she could not afford. Let me give you some numbers that really bring this home. In 1889, researchers actually did a study on the labour involved in maintaining a coal stove. Over 6 days, they found that a housewife spent 20 minutes sifting ashes, 15 minutes carrying coal, and 2 hours and 9 minutes blacking the stove to keep it from rusting. 2 hours and 9 minutes, just on maintenance. Not even on the actual cooking or water heating, just on keeping the stove itself in working condition. And what is blacking the stove, you might ask? Just iron rusts. To prevent this, women had to regularly rub their stoves with a thick black wax or paste. This was messy, tedious work. The wax got all over your hands. It smelled terrible, and you had to do it regularly or your expensive stove would rust and deteriorate. So let us add up Catherine's morning so far. She has cleaned out ashes. She has built a fire from scratch. She is now maintaining that fire, monitoring it constantly, adjusting dampers, adding fuel at regular intervals. She has already spent over an hour just on fire-related tasks, and she will spend several more hours throughout the day doing the same thing. And this is where I want to pause and acknowledge something that feels almost darkly funny. People in the late 1800s thought that the cast iron stove was a huge improvement over cooking at an open hearth. And it was in some ways. Stoves were more efficient. they wasted less heat, they were somewhat safer. But as one historian cheekily pointed out, the person who benefited most from the stove was not the woman using it. It was the man of the house, because he no longer had to chop quite as much wood. The woman still had to tend the fire constantly. She still had to manage the heat. She still had to work in oppressive conditions. The stove did not actually reduce her labour much at all. It just changed the form of that labour slightly. So when we talk about technological progress, we have to ask, progress for whom? Here is another question. Did women have any say in how stoves were designed? Not really. Stoves were designed and built by men, sold by men, marketed by men. The people actually using them every day, the women who knew exactly what features would be helpful and what features were useless. They were not consulted. Imagine how different stoves might have been if the actual users had been involved in their design. But let us move on, because we need to talk about one more aspect of fire management: the danger to children. Homes in this era were not child-proofed. The concept did not exist. So you had open flames or very hot stoves in the same rooms where young children played and toddled around. Accidents were inevitable. Mothers had to constantly watch both their fires and their children. I cannot imagine the stress of trying to do complicated work that requires focus, while also making sure your 3-year-old does not touch the stove or fall into the fire pit. Yet women did this every day. Somehow they managed to keep fires going and children safe most of the time. The times when they could not, when tragedy struck, those stories are heartbreaking. There are death records of children who died from burns, who wandered too close to a fire while their mothers were momentarily distracted. Each of those records represents a lifetime of guilt and grief for a mother who was just trying to do impossible work under impossible conditions. So now we have seen Catherine and women like her manage fire from before dawn until evening. We have seen them risk burns and exhaustion and heat stroke. We have seen them juggle fuel costs and child safety and the constant, relentless need to keep that fire going. Because without fire, there was no hot water. Without hot water, there was no washing. And without washing, there was no way to maintain the standard of cleanliness that society demanded of them. But having the water and having the fire was still not enough, because now came the actual washing, the scrubbing, the physical labour that made laundry day a full-body workout that would challenge the fittest athlete today. And that is where we go next, to the washboard, to the soap that burned their hands, to the physical toll that left women damaged for life, because this is where the real battle began. There is a sound that haunted the Mondays of 19th century America, a rhythmic scraping, a swooshing of wet fabric against ridged metal or glass. If you walked through any neighbourhood on a Monday morning, you would hear it coming from house after house, yard after yard, the sound of women at their washboards. And if you could have seen their hands up close, if you could have examined the damage that sound represented, you would understand why laundry day was not just hard work. It was a form of violence against the human body. Meet me in a small house in Baltimore, Maryland, in the spring of 1892. Inside, a woman named Josephine Turner stands at her washtub. Josephine is 34 years old, but her hands look like they belong to someone much older. The skin is cracked and rough with deep fissures that sometimes bleed. Her knuckles are swollen from years of this work. And right now, at 7 o'clock on this Monday morning, she is about to make those hands worse. Because she has 37 items of clothing to wash and every single one of them must be scrubbed. Let me describe the washboard for those of you who have never seen one up close. Imagine a rectangular frame usually made of wood, about 2 feet tall and a foot wide. Set into this frame is a ridged surface. In cheaper washboards, these ridges might be made of corrugated metal, usually zinc. In more expensive models, they might be made of glass that has been moulded into ridges. The idea is simple. You rub wet, soapy fabric up and down against these ridges, and the mechanical action forces dirt out of the fibres. Simple in concept, brutal in execution. Because the amount of force required to actually get clothes clean this way is significant. You are not gently rubbing. You are scrubbing with real pressure, using your arms, your shoulders, your back, pushing that fabric against those ridges again and again and again. Josephine picks up her husband's work shirt. It is stiff with dried sweat and dirt from his job at the docks. She dunks it in the hot soapy water that she has prepared. The water is hot enough that it would be uncomfortable to put your hand in for more than a few seconds. But Josephine's hands are going to be in this water, in and out, for hours, and he soaps up the shirt. The soap she is using is harsh. If she made it herself, it is basically lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat. This soap is alkaline enough to strip grease and dirt from fabric. It is also alkaline enough to strip the natural oils from human skin. If she bought her soap from a store, it might be slightly gentler, but not by much. Commercial soap in 1892 was not designed for sensitive skin, it was designed to clean. Now Josephine positions the wet, soapy shirt against the washboard and begins to scrub. Up and down, up and down. She is focusing on the collar first because that is where sweat and dirt accumulate. The ridges of the washboard dig into her fingers as she pushes. Her knuckles scrape against the metal, but she keeps going because the collar is not clean yet. How long does she scrub just the collar? 2 minutes, 3 minutes, until she is satisfied that the dirt has been loosened. Then she moves to the cuffs, more scrubbing, then the underarms, then the back of the shirt where sweat has soaked through. Every part of this shirt gets individual attention, individual scrubbing. And here is the thing that I think would shock us most if we had to do this work. Josephine has to scrub both sides of the shirt. The domestic manuals of the era are very clear on this point. You wash the outside of the garment first, then you turn it inside out and wash the inside. Because dirt and sweat penetrate through fabric. Washing only one side leaves the garment still dirty, so Josephine scrubs the outside, then flips the shirt and scrubs the inside. She has now spent perhaps 10 minutes on a single shirt, and she has 36 more items to go. Let me give you some context for how physically demanding this was. Modern exercise physiologists have studied the motions involved in scrubbing clothes on a washboard. They found that the repetitive motion engages the deltoids, the triceps, the latissimus dorsi, the trapezius, basically every major muscle group in the upper body and back. It is a full body workout. But here is the difference between a workout at the gym and what Josephine is doing. She cannot stop when she gets tired. She cannot take a break between sets. She cannot say, "My arms are burning, I will finish this another day." The clothes need to be washed today. So she keeps scrubbing even when her muscles are screaming, even when her hands are raw, even when her back is starting to spasm from bending over the wash tub for hours. Now let us talk about what that soap is doing to her hands. Lye is caustic. It burns. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, insidiously. Every time Josephine plunges her hands into that soapy water, every time she handles that harsh soap, the lye is breaking down the protective layer of oil on her skin. Without that protection, her skin cracks. Those cracks become deeper. Sometimes they bleed. And then she plunges her bleeding hands back into soapy water for the next garment. Do you know how much that hurts? Paper cuts hurt, right? Now imagine paper cuts all over your hands made deeper by constant work, and then imagine putting those hands into water mixed with lye. That is what Josephine is experiencing right now. That is what millions of women experienced every single Monday. There is a quote I found from a farm wife in Iowa who wrote to a magazine in the early 1900s. She said, "I wish it could be burnt into the consciousness of every man and every woman that washing under average farm conditions is a man's work, not a woman's, measured by expenditure of strength." Think about that. She said this should be men's work because it required so much physical strength and endurance. But it was not men's work, it were women's work, and women did it whether they had the physical strength or not. Tiny women, elderly women, women who were already sick or injured, they all bent over washboards and scrubbed because there was no alternative. Let me tell you about someone very different from Josephine. Her name is Ruth Washington, and she is a formerly enslaved woman living in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1885. Ruth is a professional laundress. She takes in washing from white families to earn money. This is one of the very few job opportunities available to black women in the post-Civil War South, and Ruth is doing this same work that Josephine is doing, but Ruth is washing for multiple families. She might have 100 items to wash in a week, maybe more. Ruth's hands are destroyed. There is no other word for it. Years of scrubbing on washboards with harsh soap have left her hands scarred and permanently damaged. Her joints are swollen with arthritis that started far too young because of the constant repetitive strain. But this is how Ruth feeds her children. This is how she pays rent. This is how she survives. And here is what breaks my heart. Ruth's labour is invisible to the families she washes for. They drop off their dirty laundry, they pick up their clean laundry, and they probably never think about the physical toll it took to transform one into the other. They do not see Ruth's hands, they do not see her bent back. They just see clean shirts and pressed dresses, and they pay her a pittance for this back-breaking work. How much did laundresses like Ruth earn? In the 1880s, a laundress might earn between $15 and $30 per month. That sounds like nothing to us now, and it was not much then either. A male factory worker might earn $50 or $60 per month for work that, while still difficult, did not destroy his body the way laundry work destroyed Ruth's. But let us go back to the mechanics of washing, because I want you to really understand the technique. It is not just scrubbing, there is a whole process. After Josephine or Ruth scrubs a garment thoroughly on the washboard, they have to wring it out. Wringing removes excess water and soap before the item goes to the next stage. Wringing by hand is harder than it sounds. You twist the fabric in opposite directions, squeezing as hard as you can to force water out. This takes serious grip strength. And remember, the fabric is wet and slippery and sometimes heavy. A wet bedsheet is incredibly heavy. Wringing it out requires real force. Some women developed a technique where they would twist the fabric around a stick or the edge of the washboard to get better leverage. Others worked in pairs when possible, with each person twisting in opposite directions. But many women, especially women like Ruth who worked alone, had to do this entirely by themselves. The constant twisting and gripping and squeezing led to a condition that we would now recognize as carpal tunnel syndrome. The repetitive motion inflamed the tendons in the wrists and hands. Women would lose feeling in their fingers. They would experience shooting pains up their arms, but there was no treatment available. No physical therapy, no ergonomic equipment, just pain that became part of their daily existence. And we have not even talked about the variety of fabrics that required different treatment. Cotton could be scrubbed vigorously. Wool had to be handled more gently or it would shrink and felt. Silk was delicate and required special care. Linen was tough but could be damaged by too much alkaline soap. Women had to know all of this, had to remember which items needed which treatment, had to adjust their technique accordingly. The domestic advice manuals of the era are full of instructions about this. Different water temperatures for different fabrics, different soaps, different scrubbing intensities. It was not just mindless labour, it required knowledge, skill and constant decision-making. Yet this skilled work was undervalued and underpaid, especially when done by women like Ruth. Let me share another specific example. In 1806, a woman named Margaret O'Malley was working as a laundress in a private home in Boston. The family she worked for had given her a delicate lace tablecloth to wash. Margaret knew this tablecloth was expensive and irreplaceable. She also knew that lace could not be scrubbed on a washboard the way other items could, so she spent over an hour gently washing this tablecloth by hand, carefully working soap through the intricate patterns, rinsing it multiple times in clean water. The tablecloth came out perfectly clean. The family was pleased. Did they pay Margaret extra for this skilled, time-consuming work? No, it was just expected. Part of her job. The fact that she had spent an hour on one item, using technique and care that most people could not replicate, that was invisible to them. Now I want to talk about something that might seem minor, but was actually significant. The position women had to work in. Scrubbing on a washboard meant bending over a wash tub for hours, not sitting, not standing upright, bending, hunching forward, putting constant strain on the lower back and spine. There were no ergonomic considerations in washboard design. No thought given to the fact that the person using this tool would be bent over it for 10 or 12 hours. The tubs were just standard height, which meant most women had to bend significantly to reach the water and the board. What does this do to a human spine over years and decades? It causes chronic back pain. It leads to permanent postural changes. Women who spent their lives doing laundry often developed a characteristic stoop, their bodies literally shaped by the work they did. Medical records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show that working-class women, particularly those who did heavy domestic labour, had much higher rates of back problems than women of the upper classes. This was not genetic. This was not bad luck. This was the direct result of the work they were forced to do to survive. Let me give you some numbers that put the physical toll in perspective. Researchers have estimated that scrubbing a typical load of laundry on a washboard, including wringing, took between 4 and 6 hours of continuous physical labour. The motions involved were repetitive enough to cause overuse injuries. The weight of wet laundry being lifted and wrung was enough to strain backs and shoulders. The chemicals in the soap were harsh enough to cause chemical burns and dermatitis. Add it all up and you have a recipe for chronic pain and disability. And this was not a one-time thing. This was every single week, 52 weeks a year, for decades. Is it any wonder that women's bodies broke down? But here is something remarkable. Despite all of this pain, all of this damage, women found ways to make the work slightly more bearable. They sang while they worked. Laundry songs became a tradition in some communities, particularly among black laundresses in the South. These songs had rhythm that matched the scrubbing motion, and they served to pass the time and provide a sense of solidarity. There is something deeply human about that, is there not? About finding a way to bring beauty and community into brutal labour, about refusing to be completely crushed by circumstances. Those songs were acts of resistance in their own way. They said, "You cannot take everything from us. We still have our voices." Women also developed techniques to make the scrubbing slightly easier. Some women learned that soaking clothes overnight in cold water before washing loosened dirt and required less scrubbing. Others discovered that certain stains responded better to specific treatments, sunlight for some, lemon juice for others, and this knowledge was passed down and shared. This practical knowledge, this collective wisdom developed over generations, was another form of invisible labour. Women were essentially chemists, biomechanics experts, textile specialists, all without formal training, all without recognition, all while their hands bled and their backs ached. And yet, despite all this knowledge, despite all this skill, the work was still brutal. Because knowing the best technique for removing a stain does not make scrubbing that stain any less physically demanding. Knowledge helped, but it did not eliminate the fundamental reality. Laundry was hard, painful work. Let me end this part of our journey with one more story. In 1903, A woman named Clara Jameson wrote a letter to her sister. Clara was living on a farm in Nebraska, and she'd just finished her Monday washing. She wrote, "My hands are so sore I can barely hold this pen. I looked at them tonight and thought, these are not the hands I had when I was young. These are the hands of someone much older, someone who has lived a harder life, and I am only 32. Clara was 32 years old with the hands of an elderly woman. Think about that. Think about what it means to watch your body age prematurely because of the work you must do. Think about the grief of that, the loss of who you might have been if circumstances had been different. But we are not done with laundry day yet. Not even close. Because after scrubbing comes the most dangerous part of the entire process, the boiling. The stirring of clothes in pots of water so hot that steam rises in clouds. So hot that one misstep, one moment of lost balance could mean catastrophic burns. And that is where we turn next. To the boiling water, the scalding steam, and the women who risk their lives every Monday just to get their family's clothes clean. Steam rises in thick clouds, making the air almost impossible to breathe. The heat is so intense that sweat runs down your face, your back, soaking through your dress even though you are wearing the lightest clothing you own. Your arms ache from stirring, from lifting, from the constant motion required to keep the clothes from scorching at the bottom of the pot. And then, just for a moment, you lose your balance. You stumble forward. Your hand shoots out to catch yourself and plunges into boiling water. This was not a rare accident. This was not an unlikely scenario. This happened to women all across America, over and over again, because the next stage of laundry after scrubbing was boiling, and boiling meant working with large quantities of water heated to temperatures that could permanently damage human flesh in seconds. Let me take you to a farmhouse in Tennessee in the summer of 1887. A woman named Luella Hayes is standing over a large cast-iron pot that sits on her outdoor fire. Inside this pot, bed sheets are boiling in soapy water. The pot is so large that Luella cannot see the bottom when she looks down into it. The water is bubbling violently, sending up plumes of steam that make the already oppressive July heat feel like standing inside an oven. Luella holds a long wooden stick, sometimes called a washing dolly or a laundry paddle. This stick is about 4 feet long, sturdy enough to withstand hours of stirring, but light enough that she can actually lift it. Right now, she is using this stick to agitate the sheets in the boiling water, pushing them down when they try to float to the surface, moving them around to ensure that every part of the fabric gets exposure to the hottest water. Why boiling? Why put yourself through this particular form of torture? Because in an era before effective stain removers, before bleach as we know it, before enzymatic detergents, boiling was the only way to truly sanitize white fabrics and remove certain types of stains. The combination of heat, soap, and mechanical agitation could break down oils and proteins that scrubbing alone could not touch. But the domestic manuals were very specific about how long things needed to boil. At least 30 minutes for most items, an hour for heavily soiled white linens. Some manuals recommended boiling for even longer, claiming that 2 hours of boiling would make dingy whites bright again. Let me paint the full picture for you. Luella has been standing over this pot for 45 minutes now. 45 minutes of constant stirring in heat that is making her dizzy. The fire beneath the pot has to be kept hot, which means she has had to add wood several times, bending down to feed the flames while trying not to get too close to the pot itself. Her dress is soaked with sweat. The long sleeves and long skirt that modesty requires are absolutely miserable in this heat, but she cannot take them off. So she suffers, and she stirs, and she watches the clock, waiting for the full hour to pass before she can move these sheets to the rinsing tub. But here is the dangerous part, the part that terrifies me every time I think about it. Luella has to get those boiling hot sheets out of the pot and into the rinse water. How do you safely remove fabric from boiling water when you do not have tongs long enough or strong enough to lift the weight of wet sheets? Some women use 2 sticks, trying to spear the fabric and lift it out that way. Others had a wooden fork or a specialized tool designed for this purpose. But many women simply had to reach in with the stick, hook the fabric and pull it up as quickly as possible, hoping that the water dripping off it would not splash onto their arms or hands. Luella uses her paddle to fish around in the pot, trying to snag the sheets. She gets a grip on them and starts to lift. The weight is significant. Wet sheets are heavy even in cold water. Wet sheets filled with boiling water are extremely heavy. She struggles to lift them high enough to clear the pot's rim, and then it happens. Not every time, not even most times, but often enough that every woman who did laundry lived in fear of it. The sheets slip on the paddle. They fall back into the pot with a splash. Boiling water sprays up, hitting Luella's forearm. She jerks back with a cry of pain, dropping the paddle. The burn is immediate and intense, a searing pain that brings tears to her eyes. Is this where Luella stops? Does she go inside to tend to her burn, to run cool water over it to rest? No, because the sheets still need to be rinsed. The work is not done. Luella takes a moment to breathe through the pain, retrieves her paddle and tries again. This time she succeeds in lifting the sheets and transferring them to the rinse tub. And then she goes back to the boiling pot because there are more items waiting. Let me share some statistics that show just how common these burns were. I found records from a hospital in Philadelphia that treated domestic accident victims in the 1890s. Burns from laundry-related accidents, specifically from boiling water or hot laundry implements, accounted for a significant portion of their cases. The records describe burns ranging from minor scalding to severe disfiguring injuries that required months of treatment. One case particularly stands out. In 1893, a woman named Ida Hoffman was brought to this hospital with burns covering both of her arms and part of her chest. She had been transferring clothes from a boiling pot when the pot itself tipped over, spilling gallons of boiling water onto her. Ida survived, but she spent weeks in the hospital and was left with permanent scarring. And the truly devastating detail? Ida was a professional laundress. This was her livelihood. Her injuries meant she could not work for months, which meant no income for her family. Now let us talk about what happened when women had to do this work indoors, which was necessary in cold weather. Imagine a small kitchen in a working-class home in Chicago in February 1885. Outside, the temperature is below freezing. Inside, a woman named Helga Lindstrom has a large pot boiling on her coal stove. The windows are fogged with condensation because the moisture from the boiling water has nowhere to go. The walls are literally dripping with water. The heat in the kitchen is stifling despite the cold outside, because Helga has had to keep the stove burning hot for hours. The air is so humid that it's hard to breathe, like trying to inhale soup. Helga is stirring her pot of boiling laundry, but she is also trying to manage her 2 small children who are in the house with her, because where else would they be? There is no childcare. There is no option to send them to a neighbour. So they are here, in this hot, humid, dangerous environment, and Helga has to somehow keep them safe while also doing work that requires her complete attention. Do you see the impossible situation? She cannot watch the children and watch the pot at the same time, yet she must do both. So she does what millions of mothers have done throughout history when faced with impossible demands. She does her best and she hopes it will be good enough. One historian I read estimated that the humidity level in a small kitchen during laundry day could reach 90% or higher. 90% humidity combined with high temperatures creates conditions that are genuinely dangerous to human health. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration, all of these were real risks. Yet women worked in these conditions for hours because there was no alternative. Let me tell you about a different kind of danger that came from the boiling process. The soap being used was not just harsh on skin when applied directly. When heated to boiling temperatures, it created fumes. Lye soap, when boiled, releases vapours that can irritate the lungs and eyes. Women would cough, their eyes would water, their throats would burn. But they could not step away from the pot because the clothes needed constant stirring, or they would stick to the bottom and scorch. There is a memoir I found from a woman who grew up in rural Virginia in the 1880s. She described helping her mother with laundry and wrote about how the steam and fumes would make her feel sick and dizzy. She said she often had to run outside to vomit, then come back in to continue helping because her mother could not do it all alone. Think about that. A child made sick by the fumes and heat, yet still expected to help because the labour was too much for one person to handle. This was normal. This was just Monday. Now let us talk about the equipment failures that made this work even more dangerous. Cast iron pots could crack from repeated heating and cooling. When this happened, boiling water could leak out, potentially onto someone's feet or legs. The handles on these pots could become loose over time. A loose handle on a pot containing gallons of boiling water is a disaster waiting to happen. In 1889, a woman in St. Louis was badly burned when the handle on her boiling pot broke off while she was trying to move it from the stove to a table. The pot fell, and boiling water went everywhere. The newspaper report of the incident mentioned that this type of accident was regrettably common and urged manufacturers to improve the quality of their products. But improved products cost more money, and many families were using pots that had been in use for years or even decades, with no money available to replace them. Let me shift perspective for a moment and talk about a woman whose job was to do this work for multiple families. Her name is Minnie Douglas, and she is a laundress in New Orleans in 1896. Minnie is a black woman, and being a laundress is one of the few ways she can earn money to support her 3 children. Minnie does not have just one pot of boiling laundry. She has 3, all going at the same time, because she's washing for 5 different families this week, and time is money. The faster she can get through the boiling process, the more laundry she can take on, the more she can earn. But 3 pots means 3 times the danger, 3 times the steam, 3 times the chance of an accident. Minnie moves from pot to pot, stirring each one, checking each one, adding wood to the fires beneath them, all while her small workspace fills with steam, so thick she can barely see. And here is what society asked of Minnie. They asked her to produce perfectly clean laundry to meet high standards of whiteness and freshness, while paying her barely enough to survive and giving her no safety equipment, no protection, no acknowledgement of how dangerous this work actually was. If Minnie got burned and could not work for a week, she did not get paid. Her family did not eat, so she could not afford to get burned. She had to be perfect. Every cheer, even when exhaustion made her hands shake and the steam made her dizzy. The domestic advice manuals of this era are fascinating to read because they reveal so much about the assumptions of the time. They give detailed instructions on how to boil laundry properly. They emphasize the importance of constant stirring to prevent scorching. But they say almost nothing about safety. There is no advice on how to avoid burns, no suggestion to use gloves or protective equipment. The assumption seems to be that women would just figure it out, or that injuries were simply an inevitable part of the work. One manual from 1869 does mention, almost as an afterthought, that women should be careful when removing items from boiling water. That is it. Just be careful. As if careful is enough when you are exhausted, when your muscles are trembling from hours of work, when steam has made everything slippery and visibility is poor. Let me tell you what happened to a woman named Agnes O'Connor in Boston in 1902. Agnes was boiling laundry when she had what we would now recognize as heat stroke. The combination of the July heat, the steam from the boiling pots, and hours of work without adequate water or rest caused her to collapse. She fell forward, partially into one of the pots of boiling water. Her daughter found her and pulled her out, but Agnes had sustained burns over a large portion of her body. She survived, but the recovery was long and painful. And throughout her recovery, Agnes worried constantly about money because she could not work. Her family struggled. They had to rely on charity and the help of neighbours. All because doing laundry, something we now accomplish with the push of a button, was dangerous enough to put someone in the hospital. I want to pause here and acknowledge something that feels important. We've been talking about physical dangers, about burns and heat stroke and exhaustion, but there is also a psychological toll to working in constant fear of injury. Every time a woman lifted a pot of boiling water, every time she stirred a boiling tub, there was a part of her mind that was afraid. What if I slip? What if the pot tips? What if I splash myself? Living in that state of low-level fear day after day, year after year, takes a toll on mental health that is hard to quantify but very real. Women developed anxieties around laundry day. They had nightmares about accidents. Some wrote in their diaries about the dread they felt every Sunday night, knowing that Monday was coming. There is also the question of long-term exposure to heat and steam. We know now that prolonged exposure to high heat and humidity can cause various health problems. Respiratory issues from inhaling steam and fumes, skin problems from constant dampness and heat, exhaustion that never fully goes away because you cannot recover from it before you have to do it all again. Women in the 19th century did not have the medical knowledge to understand what was happening to their bodies, but they felt it. They knew something was wrong. They knew this work was killing them slowly. But what could they do? They could not stop doing laundry. Their families needed clean clothes. Let me share one moment of dark humour from this era, because sometimes humour was the only way women coped. I found a letter written in 1898 by a woman to her friend. She wrote, "I have decided that hell when I get there will simply be an eternal Monday. I will boil laundry for all eternity, while the devil himself stands by commenting that the whites are not quite white enough." Even in her despair, she found a way to laugh at the absurdity of it all. But the absurdity was real. Society demanded perfect cleanliness, demanded bright white linens and crisp shirts, demanded all of this from women who had to risk their health and safety to achieve it. And then society turned around and dismissed this work as simple, as unskilled, as not worthy of fair compensation or even basic safety considerations. As we near the end of the boiling process, Luella finally finishes with her sheets. They have boiled for a full hour. She successfully transfers them, with only that one burn on her arm, to the rinse water. The sheets are clean now, cleaner than scrubbing alone could have made them. But Luella is exhausted, in pain, and she still has more laundry to boil. The day is far from over. And once the boiling is done, once everything has been agitated in water hot enough to sanitize it, then comes another series of steps that would test the endurance of an Olympic athlete. The rinsing, the wringing, the process of removing every trace of soap from every garment, because if soap residue remained, clothes would turn yellow or stay stiff and uncomfortable. That is where we go next. To the rinse tubs, to the endless repetition of dipping and wringing and checking, and to the innovation that promised to save women's hands but came at a price that many could not afford. Your arms are shang, not from cold but from exhaustion. You have been twisting wet fabric with every ounce of strength you possess for what feels like hours. Because it has been hours. Your hands are wrinkled from being in water constantly. Your fingers can barely grip anymore. But if you do not wring this sheet thoroughly enough, if you leave too much water in it, the fabric will turn yellow. Or worse, the The soap will not rinse out completely, and your family will wear stiff, uncomfortable clothes that irritate their skin. So you twist harder. You squeeze until your knuckles turn white, and then you do it again with the next item. Come with me to a laundry yard behind a modest home in Richmond, Virginia, in the autumn of 1891. A woman named Pearl Montgomery stands between three large wooden tubs. The first tub contains hot rinse water. The second contains cooler rinse water. The third contains water mixed with a substance called bluing, which has a faint blue tint. Pearl has just finished boiling a load of white shirts and undergarments, and now begins the process that many women considered even more tedious than the scrubbing, the rinsing. She pulls the first shirt from the pile of boiled items. It is still quite hot enough that she has to be careful handling it. She plunges it into the first rinse tub and begins swirling it through the water. This is not a quick dip. The domestic manuals are very clear. Each item must be thoroughly rinsed to remove all traces of soap. If soap remains in the fabric, it will damage the fibres over time, making clothes deteriorate faster. But how do you know when all the soap is out? Pearl uses the squeeze test. She lifts the shirt, squeezes it, and watches the water run out. If the water is still cloudy or if she sees any bubbles, there is still soap in the fabric. She dunks it again, swirls it again, squeezes again. This might take 5 or 6 repetitions per item before she is satisfied. Now comes the wringing. Pearl takes the shirt in both hands and begins to twist. She twists in opposite directions, wringing the fabric as tightly as she can to force water out. This is exhausting work. Your hands have to grip slippery, wet fabric and apply constant, forceful twisting pressure. The larger the item, the harder this becomes. Try wringing out a bath towel sometime, really wringing it until almost no water drips out, and you'll get a small taste of what Pearl is doing right now. But Pearl has an advantage that not all women had. She owns a wringer. This device, which became available in the 1860s, was one of the first pieces of technology specifically designed to ease the burden of laundry work. Let me describe it for you, because it is both ingenious and, in its own way, quite dangerous. A wringer consists of 2 rubber-covered rollers mounted in a frame. The frame clamps onto the side of a wash tub. You feed wet fabric between the rollers and turn a hand crank, which rotates the rollers and squeezes water out of the fabric much more efficiently than hand wringing can. Sounds wonderful, right? And it was, compared to the alternative. But wringers came with their own set of problems. First, there was the cost. A decent wringer in the 1890s cost anywhere from $2 to $10, depending on the quality. Remember that a professional laundress might earn $15 to $30 per month. So a wringer represented a significant investment, one that many women simply could not afford. The Montgomery Ward catalogue from 1895 listed 5 different washing machine models ranging from $2.75 to $35, while a basic washboard cost only 6 cents. The math was simple for poor families. They kept using the washboard and their own muscle power. Second, even if you could afford a wringer, it required skill to use safely. The rollers were strong enough to squeeze water from heavy fabrics like sheets and blankets. They were also strong enough to pull in a finger, a hand, even a whole arm if you were not careful. I found multiple accounts of women who had their fingers crushed in wringers, sometimes badly enough to cause permanent damage. There is a particularly harrowing account from 1897 of a woman in Ohio whose hand was pulled into the wringer up to her wrist. Her daughter heard her screaming and ran to help, but neither of them could figure out how to release the mechanism. By the time they got her hand free, several fingers were broken and the hand was so badly injured that she never regained full use of it. All from a device that was supposed to make her life easier. But let us go back to Pearl, who is experienced enough with her wringer to use it safely most of the time. She feeds the rinsed shirt between the rollers and begins turning the crank. Water pours out, much more water than she could have wrung out by hand. The shirt emerges from the other side of the rollers flattened and much drier. Pearl is grateful for this machine, even though cranking it for hours makes her shoulder ache in a different way than hand wringing did. Now the shirt goes into the second rinse tub. Yes, a second rinse, because one rinse is not enough to remove all the soap. Pearl repeats the process, swirl, squeeze, check for soap, and when satisfied, feed it through the wringer again. 2 rinses minimum, 3 for items that have been heavily soaped or boiled for a long time. Think about the repetition here. Each item in her laundry pile goes through this process twice, sometimes 3 times. Rinse, wring, rinse, wring, rinse, wring. Multiply that by 30 or 40 items. How many times is Pearl turning that wringer crank? How many times are her hands plunging into water, gripping wet fabric, guiding it through rollers? Hundreds of times, possibly over 1,000 times in a single laundry day. And we have not even gotten to the bluing yet. Let me explain what bluing is and why women used it, because this is one of those historical practices that sounds almost magical when you first hear about it. White fabrics, especially cotton and linen, tend to yellow over time. Sunlight yellows them, soap residue yellows them, age yellows them, and in an era when pristine white shirts and bright white linens were signs of respectability and good housekeeping, yellowish whites were unacceptable. Bluing is a substance that contains a small amount of blue pigment, usually Prussian blue or ultramarine. When added to rinse water, it deposits a tiny amount of blue colour onto white fabric. And here is the clever part. Blue is the opposite of yellow on the colour wheel. A slight blue tint counteracts the yellow tint, making the fabric appear whiter to the human eye. It is not actually whiter, it is a clever optical illusion. Pearl adds a carefully measured amount of bluing to her third rinse tub. Too much and the clothes will actually look blue, which would be embarrassing and would indicate that she does not know what she is doing. Too little and it will have no effect. The right amount is learned through experience, through trial and error, through years of practice. Each white item gets a final swirl in the bluing water, a final pass through the wringer, and then it goes into the basket for hanging. The process for coloured items is slightly different. They do not get bluing, obviously, because you do not want to change their colour, but they still need the double or triple rinse to remove soap. Now let me introduce you to someone working under very different circumstances. Her name is Katerina Kowalski, and she lives in a tenement building in New York City in 1898. Katerina does not have a backyard. She does not have 3 large tubs set up in a convenient workspace. She has a tiny apartment and 1 small tub that she has to fill, empty and refill multiple times. Katerina's rinsing process is even more labour-intensive than Pearl's because she cannot set up an efficient system with multiple tubs. She rinses a few items in her single tub, then she has to carry that tub of dirty rinse water down 4 flights of stairs to dump it in the courtyard. Then she climbs back up, fills the tub with clean water from the hallway pump, and rinses the next batch. How many trips up and down those stairs will Katerina make today? 20? 30? Each trip carrying either a heavy tub of water or a heavy tub of wet laundry. Her legs ache. Her back aches. But this is what laundry means when you live in a crowded city with no space and no conveniences. And Katerina cannot afford a wringer, so she wrings everything by hand, every sheet, every towel, every article of clothing. Her hands are strong from years of this work, but they are also damaged. The constant twisting motion has given her arthritis in her thumbs and wrists. She is 36 years old and her hands feel like they belong to someone much older. Let me share a detail that really brings home the physical toll of wringing by hand. Researchers who have studied historical laundry practices estimate that wringing a typical load of laundry by hand wringing it thoroughly enough that items were dry enough to hang, burned approximately 400 to 600 calories. That is equivalent to running 4 to 6 miles. Except you are not running. You are standing in one place, twisting wet fabric, using muscles in your hands, arms, shoulders, and core in repetitive motions that cause strain injuries. And remember, this is on top of all the other physical labor of the day. Hauling water burned calories. Scrubbing on the washboard burned calories. Stirring boiling pots burned calories. By the end of laundry day, a woman had performed the caloric equivalent of running a half marathon, but she did it while wet and uncomfortable, and without any of the endorphins that make running feel good. Now let us talk about what happened when the wringing process went wrong, because wrong meant ruined clothes. If you wrung too aggressively, you could tear fabric, especially delicate fabric. If you wrung unevenly, you could stretch fabric out of shape. Wool was particularly tricky. Wring wool too hard while it was wet and hot, and it would shrink and felt, becoming unwearable. There is a wonderful frustrated entry in a diary from 1889 where a woman described ruining her husband's wool vest by wringing it too hard after washing. She wrote, "I am mortified beyond words. The vest is now fit only for a child." My husband was understanding, but I could see his disappointment. Wool is expensive, and I have cost us dearly through my carelessness. She was not careless, she was exhausted. She made a mistake that any exhausted person might make, but she bore the guilt and the economic cost of that mistake. Let me tell you about an innovation that some women used to make wringing easier, though it came with trade-offs. Some women would wring fabric around a stick or pole, using the stick as leverage to twist tighter. This worked well for heavy items like sheets, but it also left marks in the fabric where the stick pressed into it. These marks usually came out during ironing, but not always. So you had to weigh the benefit of easier wringing against the risk of permanent creases. There is also the question of what to do with all the rinse water. In rural areas, women often dumped it in their yards or gardens. Some plants actually benefited from the soapy water, others did not. I found an account of a woman who accidentally killed her rose bushes by repeatedly dumping lye-heavy rinse water on them. She was heartbroken because those roses had been a gift from her mother. In cities, the rinse water often went into shared drains or courtyards, which created its own problems. If too many women dumped their rinse water in the same place, it created puddles and mud and unpleasant smells. Neighbours would argue about it. Tensions would rise, all because there was nowhere else to put the gallons and gallons of dirty water that laundry day produced. Now, let us return to the question of thoroughness, because this is where class and race intersections become painfully clear. Wealthy white women who hired laundresses, often black women or immigrant women, expected perfect results. They expected whites that were brilliantly white. They expected no soap residue. They expected crisp, fresh-smelling laundry. But these same women often provided inadequate supplies, not enough soap, not enough rinse water, not enough time to do the job properly. So laundresses like Ruth or Minnie, whom we have met before, had to make impossible choices. Do you rinse 3 times like you should, even though that means staying up until midnight to finish all the laundry? Or do you rinse twice and hope the client does not notice the slight stiffness in the fabric that indicates soap residue? And if the client did notice and complained, she would not think, perhaps I should have provided more water. She would think, this laundress does not know how to do her job properly. The laundress might lose the client, lose the income, all because she was set up to fail by insufficient resources. There is a letter I found from 1894, written by a black laundress in Atlanta to a women's magazine. She wrote, "These ladies want perfection, but they do not want to pay for it. They want whites whiter than snow, but they begrudge me the soap and the fuel to achieve it. They want their linens soft, but they complain if I use enough rinse water to actually remove the soap. I work miracles every week, and I am paid pennies for my troubles. This letter was likely not published, but the fact that she wrote it, that she took the time to articulate her frustration, tells us how keenly she felt the injustice of her situation. Let me share one more technical detail about bluing because it is fascinating in a dark way. Bluing had to be used carefully not just because of the colour issue, but because some bluings contain toxic ingredients. Prussian blue, one of the common pigments, is not particularly toxic, but some cheaper bluings contained other substances that could be harmful if they came into contact with skin repeatedly, or if they were accidentally ingested. There are accounts of children becoming ill after sucking on clothing that had been blued, or of women developing skin reactions from handling bluing powder. Yet another way that the work of keeping a household clean created health hazards for the women and children doing that work. As Pearl finishes her rinsing and wringing, as she surveys her baskets of damp, clean laundry ready to be hung, she allows herself a moment of satisfaction. The hardest physical labour is done. The scrubbing, the boiling, the endless rinsing and wringing. What remains is still work, still time-consuming, but at least it does not require the same brutal physical effort. Or so she thinks. Because what Pearl does not yet fully appreciate is that the drying and ironing phases, which come next, bring their own challenges, the weather dependency, the risk of dirt or bird droppings landing on clean clothes hanging outside, and then Tuesday, iron day, when she will heat heavy cast iron implements on her stove and press them against fabric for hours, creating a whole new kind of heat and exhaustion and danger. But for now, in this moment, Pearl's arms can rest. Her hands can stop their endless twisting and wringing. She can take a breath and maybe, if she is very lucky, sit down for 10 minutes with a cup of water before she begins the hanging. Because the laundry is clean, truly, finally clean. And that achievement, despite the cost in pain and exhaustion, is something she can be proud of. Even as she knows she will have to do it all again next Monday. The next phase of our journey takes us outside to the clotheslines and drying yards where clean laundry meets the unpredictability of weather and the judgment of neighbours, where the simple act of hanging clothes becomes a public performance of domestic competence, and where women pray that the rain holds off just a little longer. The sky is darkening. You glance up nervously as you pin the last sheet to the clothesline. Those clouds were not there an hour ago. Your entire day of backbreaking labour, all those hours of hauling and scrubbing and boiling and rinsing hangs on a line in your backyard. And if it rains before those clothes dry, you will have to do much of it over again. You cannot control the weather. You can only hope and pray and watch the sky with the anxiety of someone whose work and reputation depend entirely on forces beyond her control. Step into the backyard of a home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, on a breezy afternoon in May of 1894. A woman named Florence Blackwell is hanging her wash. She has been at this task for about 40 minutes now, and she has developed a system that is both efficient and in its own way beautiful. Heavy items like sheets and blankets go on the outer lines where the wind is strongest. Lighter items like shirts and undergarments go on the inner lines. White items get hung in the sunniest spots because sunlight naturally bleaches and brightens white fabric. Coloured items go in the shadier areas because too much sun will fade them. This is not random. This is expertise developed over years of trial and error. Florence knows which items dry fastest and which need more time. She knows that if she hangs trousers by the waistband instead of the legs, they will dry with fewer wrinkles. She knows that buttoning shirts before hanging them helps them keep their shape. She knows that sheets hung with the seam running vertically will have fewer crease marks than sheets hung horizontally. But Florence also knows something that fills her with constant low-level dread. She is being watched. Not directly, not obviously, but her neighbours can see her clothesline. And in 19th century America, a woman's clothesline was a public display of her competence as a housekeeper. Dingy whites meant she did not know how to wash properly. Clothes hung sloppily meant she was careless. Laundry left out after dark meant she was lazy or disorganized. There is a saying from this era: you can tell everything about a woman by looking at her Monday wash hanging on the line. The cleanliness of the clothes, the orderliness of the hanging, even the day and time the wash was hung out, all of this was subject to neighbourhood judgment. Women felt this pressure keenly. Let me share a story that illustrates just how serious this was. In 1889, a woman in a small town in Ohio was gossiped about extensively because her wash frequently stayed on the line into Tuesday. Her neighbours assumed she was lazy. What they did not know, what she was too ashamed to tell them, was that she was caring for her elderly mother who had dementia. The mother would sometimes wander outside and pull clothes off the line, forcing the daughter to rewash items and hang them again. The daughter endured months of gossip and social judgment rather than reveal her private struggle. Now let us talk about what happened when the weather did not cooperate, because weather was the great unknown variable in laundry day. Florence has chosen Monday to do her washing, like most women, because Monday allowed clothes to dry during the week. But what if Monday was rainy? What if the sky looked threatening all morning? Some women would postpone laundry until Tuesday, but this threw off the entire week's schedule. Tuesday was supposed to be ironing day. Wednesday was mending. Each day had its assigned tasks, and changing one meant chaos for the rest of the week. Other women would wash anyway and hope the rain held off. They would hang their wash and watch the sky with the intensity of meteorologists, ready to dash outside and gather everything at the first drop of rain. There is a diary entry from a farm wife in Iowa in 1887. She wrote, "Washed this morning though the sky looked troubling, hung everything by noon. At 2 o'clock the rains came. I have never run so fast in my life. Got most items inside, but the bed sheets were soaked through again. Cried from frustration. We'll have to rinse and rehang on the morrow. I'm so tired I can barely write this." Can you imagine? After all that's at work, to have it undone by weather. The emotional toll of that moment, the sheer despair of seeing your labour wasted, it is heartbreaking. In cities, drying presented different challenges. Let me take you to a tenement building in Boston in 1806. A woman named Bridget O'Reilly has no backyard. She has no private outdoor space at all. Her options are limited and none of them are good. She can hang her wash on lines strung across the shared courtyard, where they will drip on her neighbours below and possibly get stolen by someone desperate enough to take damp clothes. Or she can hang them inside her tiny apartment, where they will take days to dry and make the air so humid that mould grows on the walls. Bridget chooses the courtyard, because at least out there the clothes will dry by evening if the sun stays out. She carries her heavy basket of wet laundry down 3 flights of stairs. The courtyard is already crowded with other women's washing. There is an unspoken hierarchy about who gets the best spots on the lines, the spots with the most sun and air circulation. Bridget is not high in that hierarchy. She is a recent immigrant. She is young. She does not have the standing that older, more established residents have. So Bridget hangs her wash in the shadier, less desirable spots, and she hopes that no one steals her husband's good shirt, the one he wears to church on Sundays. Clothing theft from communal lines was common enough that women developed strategies to prevent it. Some would sit by the window watching their wash. Others would use distinctive markings or embroidery to identify their items, but you could not watch all the time, and items still disappeared. Now let us talk about the final stage of Monday's labour, which for many women was actually the first part of Tuesday's work, taking down the dry laundry. This sounds simple, but it too required knowledge and timing. Take clothes down too early, when they are still damp, and they will mildew. Take them down too late, after the evening dew has settled, and they will be damp again and need extra ironing time. Florence goes out to her clothesline around 4 in the afternoon. She tests each item with her hand, feeling for dampness. The sheets are dry, thank goodness, their edges snapping in the breeze. The shirts are ready, but some of the heavier items, the work trousers and the thick wool socks, need more time. So she takes down what is ready and leaves the rest. As she unpins each item, she folds it carefully and places it in her basket. This is not just for tidiness. How you fold items when taking them off the line affects how much ironing you will need to do later. Fold with care and smooth out wrinkles as you go, and ironing becomes slightly easier. Just wad everything into the basket and you create more work for yourself. And speaking of ironing, let us move forward to Tuesday morning, because Tuesday was universally known as Iron Day, and Iron Day was its own special kind of torture. Meet me in a kitchen in rural Georgia in the summer of 1893. The temperature outside is already 85 degrees at 9 in the morning. It will reach 95 by afternoon. Inside this kitchen, a woman named Delia Freeman is heating her saddlerons on the wood stove. A saddleron is a solid piece of cast iron, flat on the bottom with a handle on top. It weighs anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds depending on the size. The name comes from an old word meaning solid, because these irons were solid metal all the way through. To heat them, you set them on a hot stove. To use them, you pick them up by the handle, which is also heated, and press them against fabric with significant force to smooth out wrinkles. Delia has 3 irons heating. Why 3? Because one iron does not stay hot for very long. You use one while the other 2 heat. When the first one cools down too much to be effective, you put it back on the stove and grab the next hot one. This rotation continues for hours, but here is the problem. The stove has to stay hot all day to keep the irons hot, which means Delia is working in a kitchen that feels like an oven, literally. The temperature in her kitchen is probably over 100 degrees. The humidity from yesterday's washing, some of which she had to hang indoors overnight, makes the air thick and hard to breathe. Sweat runs down her face, her back soaking through her dress, and yet Delia must work carefully and precisely. If the iron is too hot, it will scorch the fabric, leaving brown marks that cannot be removed. If it is too cool, it will not remove wrinkles effectively, and she will have to go over the same spots repeatedly. So she tests the iron temperature using methods passed down through generations. She spits on the iron and watches how the saliva reacts. If it sizzles and disappears instantly, too hot. If it sits there doing nothing, too cold. If it dances and evaporates in a second or two, just right. Yes, you read that correctly. Women tested iron temperature by spitting on them. In a more genteel variation, they would wet their finger and touch the iron briefly. Either way, you risk burning yourself to avoid burning your laundry. Let me describe the ironing process in detail because the physical demands are significant. Delia picks up a hot iron. It weighs about 7 pounds. She presses it against a shirt collar, using substantial downward pressure to smooth the fabric. She moves the iron in long, careful strokes. Her arm is extended, her wrist is locked, her whole upper body is engaged in pushing this heavy piece of metal across fabric. How long does it take to iron one shirt? 10 minutes. 15 minutes for a dress shirt with a complicated collar and cuffs. Multiply that by every shirt, every dress, every petticoat, every tablecloth, every pillowcase that needs to be crisp and smooth. We are talking about hours and hours of standing, lifting, pressing, all while holding a piece of metal that weighs as much as a newborn baby. And the danger. Oh, the danger. Delia has small burn marks on her hands and arms, souvenirs from years of ironing. Sometimes she miscalculates and grabs an iron handle that is hotter than she thought. Sometimes her hand slips and touches the hot surface. Sometimes she is just so exhausted that her coordination fails and accidents happen. There is a tragic story from 1898 in Pennsylvania. A woman named Hannah Morrison was ironing late in the evening, trying to finish after putting her children to bed. She was exhausted. She reached for an iron on the stove and misjudged in the dim lamplight. Her hand closed around the hot iron itself instead of the handle. The scream brought her husband running, but the damage was done. Hannah had third-degree burns across her palm and fingers. The doctor said she would likely never regain full use of that hand. And the cruelest detail? Hannah was a seamstress. She sewed for other families to supplement her household income. The injury to her hand meant she could not work for months. Her family struggled financially, all because she was trying to complete one more household task at the end of an already exhausting day. Now let us talk about the knowledge and skill required for ironing different fabrics. Cotton could be ironed quite hot and damp, which actually made it easier to get crisp results. Linen was similar, though you had to be careful not to scorch it. Wool had to be ironed carefully with a damp cloth between the iron and the fabric to prevent shine and scorching. Silk required a cool iron and a light touch. Velvet could not be ironed directly at all. It had to be steamed carefully or the nap would be crushed. Women had to know all of this. They had to remember which fabric was which temperature was appropriate for each, which items needed starch and which did not. It was not mindless labour. It required constant attention and decision-making. Speaking of starch, let us talk about starching because this was yet another step in the process. Starch was a mixture of potato starch or cornstarch dissolved in water. You dipped certain items like shirt collars and cuffs into this mixture, then wrung them out and let them dry partially. When you ironed these starched items, the heat set the starch and created a stiff, crisp finish that was considered the hallmark of good laundry work. But starch had to be made fresh. It could not sit around or it would ferment and smell terrible. So women had to prepare starch on ironing day, adding yet another task to an already overwhelming schedule. And if you got the proportions wrong, if the starch was too thick, it would flake off the fork. Too thin and it would have no effect. Just right required practice and judgment. There is something darkly funny about the fact that we put women through all of this to achieve a look that was, quite frankly, uncomfortable for the men wearing the starched shirts. Starched collars were stiff and scratchy, but fashion and respectability demanded them, so women spent hours creating this particular discomfort for their husbands and sons. Let me share one woman's perspective on this. In 1901, a woman wrote to a ladies' magazine under a pseudonym. She said, "If men had to iron their own shirts, stiff collars would disappear from fashion within a month. But because it is we who do the work, because our suffering is invisible to them, the fashion persists. I have suggested to my husband that he might try wearing soft collars. He looked at me as if I had suggested he go naked. Respectability, you see, is more important than my aching arms." That letter was likely never published. It was too pointed, too critical, but the fact that she wrote it, that she felt the need to articulate this frustration tells us so much. As Delia works through her ironing pile on this sweltering Tuesday, as her arms begin to shake from fatigue, as her vision blurs from the heat and the sweat dripping into her eyes, she thinks about Thursday. Thursday is the day she will have to do this all over again for the clothes that accumulated since Monday, because one wash day per week is not actually enough for a large family. Some items need washing twice a week, so Thursday is a smaller repeat of Monday and Tuesday, never-ending cycle. But before Thursday comes Wednesday, mending day, when Delia will sit with her sewing basket and repair all the small damages that wear and use have inflicted on her family's clothing. Because in an era when new clothing was expensive and not easily replaced, you mended and mended and mended until fabric was more patch than original cloth. And this brings us to a crucial question that we have been circling around throughout this entire journey. What did this work cost women? Not just in physical toll, though we have seen how significant that was, but in time, in opportunities lost, in dreams deferred, in the life they might have lived if they had not been consumed by the endless demands of keeping a household running without modern conveniences. That is where we turn next, to the soap that women made themselves from scratch, process so labour-intensive and dangerous that it deserves its own chapter in this story of survival and endurance. Imagine standing over a large iron pot filled with a substance that could burn through your skin if you are not careful. The smell is acrid, almost overwhelming, a combination of rendered animal fat and something chemical that makes your eyes water. You stir this mixture with a long wooden paddle, knowing that if you make even a small mistake in the proportions, the result could be useless at best, dangerous at worst. This is not a scene from a chemistry laboratory. This is soap-making day on a farm in rural America, and this is work that women did regularly, adding yet another layer of skilled, dangerous labour to their already impossible workload. Come with me to a small farmstead in Kentucky in the early spring of 1886. A woman named Abigail Crawford is preparing for soap making, a task she undertakes twice a year, usually in spring and fall. The process begins weeks before the actual soap-making day because Abigail has to gather ingredients. And gathering ingredients means saving things that most of us today would consider garbage. First, she needs wood ash. Not just any ash, but ash from hardwood fires, preferably oak or hickory. Abigail has been collecting ashes from her fireplace and cook stove all winter long, storing them in a wooden barrel outside her kitchen door. By March, she has accumulated about 2 barrels full of ash. This represents months of fires, months of cooking and heating, all saved for this purpose. Second, she needs fat, animal fat. Specifically, she needs tallow, which is rendered beef or mutton fat, or lard, which is rendered pork fat. Where does this fat come from? From butchering. When Abigail's husband slaughtered a pig or a cow, nothing went to waste. The meat was eaten or preserved, the bones were used for stock or tools, and the fat was carefully cut away, stored and saved for soap making. By spring, Abigail has about 20 pounds of fat saved up. Some of it is fresh from recent butchering. Some of it has been sitting in her cold cellar for months, growing increasingly rancid and foul-smelling. This is what she will turn into the soap that her family will use to wash their bodies, their clothes, their dishes, everything. Let me describe the first stage of soap making lye water. Lye is the caustic alkali that, when combined with fat, creates soap through a chemical reaction called saponification. But in 1886 Kentucky, Abigail does not go to a store and buy lye. She makes it from those wood ashes she's been saving. Abigail takes a large wooden barrel and drills a small hole near the bottom. She places this barrel on a platform with a bucket underneath to catch drips. Then she fills the barrel with wood ash, packing it down firmly. On top of the ash, she pours water. Lots of water. The water percolates through the ash, leaching out the potassium compounds, and drips out the bottom into the bucket as lye water. This process takes days. You cannot rush it. The water drips slowly, so slowly that it might take a full week to process 1 barrel of ash. And the resulting lye water varies in strength depending on the type of wood, how the ashes were burned, how much water you used, a dozen variables that even experienced soap makers could not always control perfectly. How do you know if your lye water is strong enough? Abigail uses a test that has been passed down for generations. She drops a fresh egg into the lye water. If the egg sinks, the lye is too weak. If the egg floats with just a small area, about the size of a dime, showing above the water surface, the lye is just right. If too much of the egg shows, the lye is too strong and needs to be diluted. Think about the empirical knowledge required here. Someone generations ago figured out through trial and error that an egg would float at just the right height when lye water was the correct strength for soap making. And this knowledge was passed from mother to daughter, year after year, in kitchens and farmyards across America. But here is where it gets dangerous. Lye is extremely caustic. If it splashes on your skin, it burns. Not like a hot stove burns, where you pull away and the damage is immediate and then stops. Lye continues to burn as long as it's in contact with skin, eating through tissue. Women who made soap regularly often had scars on their hands and arms from lye burns. There is an account from a doctor in rural Missouri in 1890 who treated a woman who had been making soap when a container of lye water tipped over. The lye splashed onto her legs and feet. By the time she could wash it off with enough water to stop the burning, she had severe chemical burns that took months to heal. The doctor wrote that he saw several such cases every year, always women, always from soap-making accidents. Now comes the second stage, rendering the fat. Abigail takes her 20 pounds of saved fat, some of it fresh, some decidedly not, and places it in a large cast-iron pot over an outdoor fire. She has to heat this fat slowly, melting it down and cooking out any bits of meat or tissue that might have been attached. This process is called rendering, and it smells absolutely terrible. Imagine rancid animal fat being heated for hours. The smell is so strong that Abigail does this outside, as far from the house as to practical. Even so, the smell permeates everything. Her clothes will smell like rendered fat for days. Her hair will smell like it. The smell gets into the wood of her house and lingers. But Abigail cannot just walk away and let the fat render itself. She has to stir it constantly and monitor the temperature carefully. If the fat gets too hot, it will scorch and turn dark, and the resulting soap will be poor quality. If it does not get hot enough, impurities will not cook out, and again, poor quality soap. So she stands over this pot of smelly, bubbling fat, stirring and watching for hours. When the fat is fully rendered, she strains it through cheesecloth to remove any remaining solid bits. What remains is clear, liquid fat. This will harden as it cools, but right now, while it is hot and liquid, is when she needs to combine it with the lye water to make soap. This is the moment that requires the most skill and the most courage. Abigail pours her lye water into another large iron pot and sets it over the fire. She brings it to a specific temperature, not boiling but quite hot. Then slowly and carefully she begins adding the rendered fat. The proportions are crucial. Too much lye in the soap will be harsh and caustic, potentially dangerous to use. Too little lye and the fat will not fully saponify, resulting in a greasy, ineffective soap. The traditional ratio is roughly 1 pound of fat to 1 quart of lye water, but this varies depending on the strength of your lye, the type of fat you are using, and factors that even experienced soap makers sometimes struggle to predict. Abigail stirs, and stirs, and stirs. The mixture must be stirred constantly for the next several hours as the chemical reaction takes place. This is exhausting work. Her arms ache. The heat from the fire is intense. The fumes from the mixture make her eyes burn and her throat feel raw. But she cannot stop stirring or the soap will not come together properly. Let me share a story about what happens when soap making goes wrong. In 1883, a woman in rural Tennessee was making soap with her teenage daughter helping. The daughter, eager to speed up the process, added too much fat too quickly. The mixture splattered, sending drops of hot, caustic liquid onto both of them. The mother got drops on her arm and hand, causing burns. The daughter got a drop in her eye. The eye injury was serious. The caustic mixture burned the surface of the girl's eye. The local doctor did what he could, but medical treatment in rural Tennessee in 1883 was limited. The girl partially lost vision in that eye. For the rest of her life she bore the consequence of one moment of impatience during soap making. After hours of stirring, Abigail's soap mixture begins to thicken. She tests it by lifting her paddle and watching how the mixture drips. When it forms thick ribbons that hold their shape for a moment before sinking back into the pot, the soap is nearly ready. She adds a bit more lye water if needed, or a bit more fat, making final adjustments based on how the mixture looks and feels. Then comes the pouring. Abigail has prepared wooden moulds, simple boxes lined with cloth. She carefully ladles the hot soap mixture into these moulds and smooths the top. Now the soap must sit and cure. It will take several weeks for the saponification process to complete fully and for excess moisture to evaporate. Only then will the soap be safe and effective to use. But even after curing, homemade lye soap is harsh. It has a high pH similar to modern drain cleaners. This is the soap that women used on their hands multiple times a day. This is the soap they used to wash dishes, to wash clothes, to bathe children. No wonder their hands were constantly damaged and sore. Now let us talk about the economics of soap making versus buying soap, because this is where class distinctions become very clear. By the late 1800s, commercial soap was available in most areas. You could buy a bar of soap for a few cents. But a few cents, multiplied by the amount of soap a household needed per year, added up to real money for families living on tight budgets. If you could make your own soap from materials you already had, from ashes you would otherwise throw away and fat you would otherwise discard, then you saved those few cents per bar. For a wealthy family, this savings was meaningless. But for a poor family, those savings might mean the difference between having shoes for the children or not. So poor women made soap. Wealthier women bought soap. And the women caught in the middle, the ones who could technically afford to buy soap but felt guilty spending money on something they could make themselves, they made soap and resented every minute of it. There is a letter from 1892 written by a farmer's wife in Iowa. She wrote to her sister who had moved to a city. "I made soap yesterday, and I thought of you the entire time. I thought of how you can simply go to a store and purchase a bar of soap whenever you need one. I do not begrudge you this luxury, but I confess I envy it terribly. My hands are raw from the lye, and my back aches from the stirring, and I smell like a rendering plant. And I will do this all again in 6 months, because we cannot afford to buy what I can make for free." That word free is important, because the soap was not free. It cost Abigail and women like her hours of labour, exposure to dangerous chemicals and physical suffering. But because that cost was not paid in money, it was considered free. Their labour, their pain, their health, these things had no monetary value. Let me tell you about the innovations that were supposed to make soap making easier. By the 1880s, you could buy commercial lye in crystallized form. This eliminated the need to make lye water from ashes, which was safer and more consistent. But many women still made their own lye water because buying commercial lye meant spending money, and using wood ashes meant not spending money. There were also soap-making books published with precise recipes and instructions. But these books cost money to buy and required literacy to use. Many women, especially immigrant women and poor rural women, did not have access to such resources. They relied on knowledge passed down orally, on what their mothers and grandmothers had taught them. And there is something beautiful about that oral tradition, even as we acknowledge its limitations, the knowledge of soap making, of how to test lye strength with an egg, of how to judge when the mixture was ready by the way it ribboned off the paddle, This was women's knowledge. This was expertise developed and refined over generations. It was chemistry, practical chemistry, performed by women who would never be allowed into a university chemistry laboratory, but who nevertheless understood saponification through years of hands-on experience. Let me introduce you to one more woman before we leave the topic of soap. Her name is Esther Chen, and she is a Chinese immigrant living in San Francisco in 1895. Esther runs a small laundry business, washing clothes for bachelor miners and railroad workers. She goes through soap at an astonishing rate because she is washing professionally, doing the laundry for dozens of men every week. Esther cannot afford to buy all the soap she needs. The cost would eat into her already slim profit margins, so she makes soap, huge batches of it every few weeks. She has become expert at it through necessity. She can judge lye strength without the egg test, just by the feel and appearance of the water. She knows exactly when the soap mixture has reached the right consistency. She has optimized her process to minimize time while maximizing yield. But Esther's hands. Her hands are destroyed. The constant exposure to lye, both in the soap she makes and in the harsh soap she uses for washing, has left her hands scarred, cracked, and painful. She is only 32 years old, but her hands look ancient, and she knows that this will only get worse as she continues this work year after year. Esther represents thousands of women who made soap not for their own families, but as part of their paid labor. Laundresses, boarding house operators, anyone who washed commercially needed soap in quantities that made buying it prohibitively expensive. So they made it themselves and bore the physical cost. As we close this chapter on soap making, I want you to hold in your mind the image of Abigail standing over her pot of caustic soap mixture, stirring for hours despite her exhaustion, creating something essential from materials others would have thrown away. Her labor saved her family money. Her expertise, passed down through generations, allowed her to perform practical chemistry without formal education. But her reward was damaged hands, chemical burns, and the certainty that she would have to do this all over again in 6 months. And here is the question that has been building throughout our journey. Who did this work? Who bore the burden of laundry in 19th century America? Because while we have seen many examples of housewives doing their own washing, we have also caught glimpses of another reality. The reality of professional laundresses, of domestic servants, of women who washed other people's clothes for money. And when we look closely at who these women were, we see patterns of class and race that tell a much larger story about American society. That is where we turn next, to the women whose labor was not just undervalued, but whose very existence was often erased from the historical record. Picture two women, both standing over washtubs on the same Monday morning in 1888. Both are scrubbing clothes on washboards. Both have hands raw from harsh soap. Both are exhausted before the day has barely begun. But one of these women will go home to her own family when the work is done. The other is already home, and the clothes she is washing belong to the first woman's family. One woman is paying, one woman is being paid. And that difference, that seemingly simple transaction of money for labor, reveals some of the deepest inequalities in American society. Because when we ask who did the laundry in 19th century America, the answer is complicated and often painfully unjust. Let us begin with numbers, because numbers tell a story that is easy to overlook. The 1870 United States Census revealed something remarkable. 52% of all employed women in America worked as domestic servants, more than half. Of all the jobs available to women, domestic service was by far the most common, and within domestic service, laundry work was one of the primary duties. But here is what those numbers hide. Who were these domestic servants? The census data shows us clearly. They were disproportionately black women, particularly in the South. They were immigrant women, especially Irish and German immigrants in northern cities. They were the poorest women in American society, women who had no other options, no other way to survive. Let me take you inside a wealthy home in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1889. The lady of the house, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, has never done her own laundry, not once in her entire adult life. She employs 2 domestic servants, a cook and a laundress. The laundress is a black woman named Sarah Williams, who was born enslaved and gained her freedom at the end of the Civil War, some 24 years earlier. Sarah arrives at the Whitmore house every Monday morning at 5 o'clock. She enters through the back door, as she is expected to do. She never uses the front entrance. That would be inappropriate, a violation of the social order that everyone, including Sarah, understands and must accept to keep her job. Sarah's workday will last 12 to 14 hours. She will wash the Whitmore family's clothes using the process we have explored in such detail. Hauling water, heating it, scrubbing on a washboard, boiling, rinsing, wringing, hanging. All of it. Every exhausting, painful step. And at the end of this day, Sarah will be paid 50 cents. 50 cents for 14 hours of back-breaking labour. That works out to less than 4 cents per hour. Let me put that in context. A male factory worker in 1889 might earn $1.50 for a 10-hour day, or 15 cents per hour. Sarah is being paid about 1/4 of what a man doing industrial labour would earn, for work that is arguably more physically demanding and certainly more dangerous to her health. But Sarah needs this job. She has 3 children to feed. Her husband works as a labourer when he can find work, but employment for black men in the post-Reconstruction South is sporadic and poorly paid. Sarah's income from laundry work is essential to her family's survival. So she does not complain about the 50 cents, she does not protest the long hours or the harsh conditions. She shows up every Monday, enters through the back door, and washes the Whitmore family's clothes. Now let us think about Mrs. Whitmore for a moment. She considers herself a kind employer. She sometimes gives Sarah leftover food to take home. At Christmas, she gives Sarah a small gift, perhaps a length of fabric or a bar of store-bought soap. Mrs. Whitmore believes she is being generous, treating her servant well. But does Mrs. Whitmore ever consider what 50 cents means to Sarah? Does she think about the fact that Sarah is destroying her own health to keep the Whitmore family in clean clothes? Does she acknowledge that the reason her own hands are soft and unblemished is because Sarah's hands are scarred and damaged? Probably not, because the social structure of 1889 Charleston makes such thoughts unnecessary. Sarah is there to serve. That is simply the natural order of things, except it is not natural. It is constructed. It is maintained through economic desperation and social hierarchy, and in the South, through the lingering legacy of slavery. Sarah does this work not because she chose it as a career, but because she has no other choice. And Mrs. Whitmore benefits from Sarah's lack of options, without having to acknowledge that her comfort is built on Sarah's suffering. Let me introduce you to another woman working in domestic service, but in a very different context. Her name is Bridget Murphy, and she is an Irish immigrant living in New York City in 1891. Bridget works as a live-in domestic servant for a middle-class family in Brooklyn. Her duties include cooking, cleaning, and laundry. She lives in a small room in the attic of the family's home. Her wages are $3 per week plus room and board. $3 per week sounds better than Sarah's 50 cents per day, and in some ways it is. But Bridget is essentially on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. She has no private life, no freedom to come and go as she pleases. If she wants an afternoon off, she must ask permission. If the family needs her to work late into the evening or start early in the morning, she has no right to refuse. Bridget writes letters to her sister back in Ireland. In one letter from 1891, she described her life. I work from before dawn until after the family has gone to bed. I eat my meals alone in the kitchen. I am not permitted to use the front stairs. The children of the house call me Bridget, but I must call them Master Thomas and Miss Elizabeth, even though they are younger than I am. I am saving money to bring you to America, but sometimes I wonder if this is truly the land of opportunity, or simply a different kind of servitude. That last line is powerful, is it not? A different kind of servitude. Bridget is not enslaved. She is paid for her work. She can theoretically quit and find another position, but in practice her options are so limited that the difference between her situation and outright bondage sometimes feels very small. Now let us talk about the hierarchy even within domestic service, because not all laundry workers had the same status or pay. In very wealthy households there might be multiple servants with specialized roles. A washerwoman did only the washing, a laundress did the washing and the ironing, and handled fine linens and delicate garments. The laundress had higher status and better pay than the washerwoman, but even the highest paid laundress in a wealthy household was still at the bottom of society's ladder. She was still someone who worked with her hands, who got dirty, who was not considered respectable in the way that middle-class women were expected to be. There is a fascinating book published in 1889 called The Servant Question that tried to address why so few American-born women were willing to work as domestic servants. The author interviewed dozens of young women asking why they preferred factory work to domestic service, even though factory work often paid less and had worse conditions in many ways. The answers were revealing. Women said that in a factory, when your shift ended, you were done. Your time was your own. You could go home, see your family, have a social life. In domestic service, you had no such freedom. Women also said that factory work, despite its hardships, felt more dignified. You were a worker among workers. In domestic service, you were always reminded of your inferior status, always entering through the back door, always being treated as less than fully human. Let me tell you about a movement emerged in the 1880s that tried to address some of these injustices. In Atlanta, Georgia, black laundresses organized. They formed the Washing Society in 1881 and went on strike demanding better wages and better working conditions. These women, most of them formerly enslaved, many of them illiterate, organized themselves into a labor union and took collective action. Their demands were straightforward. They wanted $1 per dozen pounds of laundry instead of the prevailing rate of 50 to 75 cents. They wanted clients to provide adequate soap and washing supplies. They wanted to be treated with basic respect and dignity. The strike involved thousands of women. For weeks, white families across Atlanta struggled to find anyone willing to wash their clothes. Some families tried to do their own laundry and quickly discovered how difficult it was. Others offered higher wages to break the strike. But the Washing Society held firm. Eventually, the city government got involved, threatening to require expensive licenses for laundry work and even threatening to arrest strike leaders. The strike was broken. The women did not win all their demands, but they had made themselves visible. They had asserted their worth. They had said, "Our labor has value, and we will not be exploited without resistance." Think about the courage that required. These were women living in the Jim Crow South, where black people had virtually no legal rights or protections. They were women whose families could be evicted, who could lose what little they had, who risked violence for organizing. Yet they did it anyway. They stood up and demanded justice. Now let us shift perspective and talk about women who took in laundry in their own homes rather than working in someone else's house. This was often seen as preferable because it allowed women to care for their own children while earning money. But the economics were harsh. Meet Josefina Rossi, an Italian immigrant living in Boston in 1900. Josefina's husband works as a construction laborer when work is available, but construction work is seasonal and unreliable. To supplement the family income, Josephina takes in laundry from several middle-class families in her neighborhood. Josephina charges 75 cents per family per week. She washes for 4 families, which means she earns $3 per week from laundry work. But she has to provide all her own supplies: soap, fuel for heating water, starch, bluing, everything. These costs eat into her earnings. By the time she accounts for supplies, she is probably netting about $2 per week. For this $2, Josephina works at least 30 hours, probably more. She does all her laundry work on Mondays and Tuesdays, washing on Monday and ironing on Tuesday. That means 2 full days of labor for $2. But those $2 might mean her children eat adequately that week. They might mean rent gets paid. So Josephina scrubs and boils and irons until her hands bleed and her back screams in protest. And here is something that breaks my heart. Josephina's own family's laundry gets done on Wednesday, if she has any energy left. Her children often wear clothes that are less clean than the clothes she washes for paying customers. Her own sheets are changed less frequently than the sheets of the families who pay her. She gives her best work, her cleanest results, to strangers who pay her, while her own family makes do with whatever is left of her energy and time. Let me share some statistics that really illustrate the economic exploitation involved. A study done in New York in 1909 by the Russell Sage Foundation found that 60% of working-class families spent some money on laundry services. This tells us that even poor families living on tight budgets, would rather pay for laundry than do it themselves if they could possibly afford it. But think about what this means. Poor families paying other poor families to do work that nobody wants to do. The money stays within the working class, circulating from one desperate household to another, while wealthy families benefit from the labor of all of them without ever having to dirty their own hands. There were also commercial laundries emerging in cities by the 1890s. These were businesses where multiple women worked together washing clothes that customers dropped off. The conditions in these laundries were often appalling. Hot, humid, poorly ventilated rooms where women worked 12 to 14-hour shifts. The pay was low, the work was dangerous, and there were no protections if you got injured or sick. A report from a commercial laundry in Chicago in 1893 described conditions that sound like something from a nightmare. The temperature in the washing room regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Women fainted from heat exhaustion regularly. Burns from hot water and steam were common. The noise from the machines was so loud that many workers suffered hearing damage. And the pay was $6 per week for 6 12-hour days of work. But women took these jobs because they needed the money, because even $6 per week was better than nothing, because they had children to feed and rent to pay and no other options available to them. Now, I want to talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of domestic labor: the psychological toll of doing other people's housework. When you wash someone else's dirty clothes, when you scrub their soiled linens, you are intimately involved in the most private aspects of their lives. You see their bodily functions, their lack of cleanliness, their private stains. But you are expected to be invisible, to never acknowledge what you see, to maintain the fiction that your employers are pristine and perfect. There is a profound indignity in that, and being so close to someone's private life, yet being treated as if you do not exist as a full person. Many domestic workers spoke about this feeling of invisibility, of being simultaneously essential and dismissed. A black domestic worker in Washington, D.C. wrote in her diary in 1897, "I know things about the families I work for that their closest friends do not know. I know their habits, their weaknesses, their secrets. Yet if I meet Mrs. Harrison on the street, she barely acknowledges me. I am close enough to wash her undergarments, but not close enough to greet her as an equal in public. Sometimes I wonder if she even sees me as human." As we near the end of this exploration of who did the washing, I want you to hold all these women in your mind. Sarah in Charleston earning her 50 cents for 14 hours of labour. Bridget in Brooklyn living in servitude that is legal but scarcely more dignified than slavery. Josephina in Boston sacrificing her own family's comfort to earn a few dollars from strangers. The striking laundresses of Atlanta risking everything to demand basic dignity. These women were not just doing laundry, they were surviving. They were supporting families, they were navigating systems of oppression that sought to keep them in their place. And they were doing all of this while performing labour so physically demanding that it broke their bodies and shortened their lives. But there is one more layer to this story. One more innovation that promised to change everything. The washing machine. The mechanical device that was supposed to liberate women from this endless drudgery. Did it work? Did early washing machines actually make life easier? Or did they create new problems while solving old ones? That is where our journey takes us next, to the inventions and innovations that transformed laundry work, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. Progress. We love that word, do we not? It suggests movement forward, improvement, problem solved. And when inventors in the mid-1800s began tinkering with machines designed to wash clothes, progress seemed inevitable. Surely, they thought, we can build something better than a woman bent over a washboard for hours. Surely technology can save women from this brutal labour. And they did build machines, hundreds of different designs, each one promising to revolutionise laundry day. But here is the question nobody seemed to ask. Progress for whom, and at what cost? Walk with me into a kitchen in Columbus, Ohio in the year 1807. A woman named Margaret Hartley is standing in front of a washing machine. Yes, a washing machine. But this is not the machine you're picturing. This is not something you load, press a button, and walk away from. This is a large wooden tub mounted on a frame with a mechanism inside that in theory agitates the clothes. And Margaret is turning a hand crank around and around, providing the power that makes the mechanism work. Margaret paid $25 for this machine 2 years ago. $25. To put that in perspective, a professional laundress in 1895 might earn about $20 per month. So this machine cost more than a month's wages for a working woman. It was a significant investment, one that Margaret's husband questioned at the time. But the salesman had been so convincing. He promised that this machine would cut her laundry time in half. He promised her hands would no longer be damaged by the harsh soap and constant scrubbing. He promised liberation. 2 years later, Margaret is not sure she has been liberated. She still had to haul all the water, still had to heat it on the stove, still had to sort the clothes and soap them. The machine helps with the agitation, yes. Her arms turn the crank instead of scrubbing on a washboard. But is turning a crank for an hour any easier than scrubbing for an hour? Her arms still ache, her shoulders still hurt, and now she has this large, awkward machine taking up space in her kitchen, a constant reminder of the $25 they spent. Plus, the machine breaks, often. There are gears and mechanisms inside that wooden tub, and they jam or break or wear out. When this happens, Margaret has to get it repaired, which costs more money, or she has to go back to the washboard anyway. The machine promised to make her life easier, but instead it has added a layer of expense and complication. Let me share some numbers that tell the story of early washing machines. The 1895 Montgomery Ward catalogue, which we have mentioned before, listed 5 different washing machine models. The prices ranged from $2.75 for a very basic model to $35 for a top-of-the-line version. Compare this to the cost of a washboard, 6 cents. 6 cents versus $2.75 at minimum. For poor families, for working-class families, the choice was obvious. They could not afford the machine, but even families who could afford the machine often found them disappointing. A study done in the early 1900s asked housewives about their washing machines. Many reported that the machines did not actually save much time. You still had to do all the same preparatory work. You still had to boil items separately. You still had to rinse and wring by hand, unless you also bought a separate wringer attachment, which was more money. And here is something fascinating. Many women said they did not trust the machines to get clothes truly clean. They worried that the mechanical agitation was not as thorough as hand scrubbing, so they would use the machine for lightly soiled items but still hand scrub the really dirty things, which meant they were doing both methods, machine and hand, instead of the machine replacing handwork entirely. Let me introduce you to another woman with a very different washing machine experience. Her name is Ingrid Olsen, and she is a farmer's wife in rural Wisconsin in 1903. Ingrid's husband, always interested in mechanical innovations, built her a washing machine, built it himself from wood and metal parts, following a design he saw in a farming magazine. This homemade machine consists of a barrel with paddles inside. You fill the barrel with hot water and soap and clothes, seal the lid in, and then rock the entire barrel back and forth. The rocking motion causes the paddles to agitate the clothes. In theory, this should work well. In practice, Ingrid finds it exhausting. The barrel, when full of water and clothes, is extremely heavy. Rocking it back and forth requires significant strength and effort. After 30 minutes of rocking the barrel, her whole body aches. Also, the machine leaks. Her husband's carpentry skills, while admirable, were not quite up to the task of creating a watertight seal. So Ingrid rocks the barrel and water slowly seeps out, creating puddles on her kitchen floor that she then has to mop up. She has tried to explain to her husband that the machine is not actually saving her any work, but he's so proud of having built it that she does not have the heart to tell him she would rather go back to the washboard. This story repeats itself in homes across America. Well-meaning husbands buying or building washing machines, convinced they are helping their wives, while the wives discover that the machines create as many problems as they solve. And the wives often stay silent about their disappointment because they do not want to seem ungrateful, or because they do not want to admit that the expensive machine was not worth the cost. Now let us talk about the different types of early washing machines, because there were dozens of designs, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. There were machines with dollies that you plunged up and down, machines with paddles that you rocked back and forth, machines with cranks that turned internal mechanisms, machines that looked like butter churns, machines that resembled torture devices. Inventors were throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick. One particularly interesting design was called the vacuum washer. This was a plunger device that you pushed down into a tub of water and clothes. The plunger created suction that supposedly drew water and soap through the fabric. Did it work? Sort of. It was less physically demanding than scrubbing on a washboard, but it was slow. You had to plunge each item individually multiple times. A full load of laundry could take hours with this method. There is a wonderful, slightly sarcastic advertisement from 1901 for a washing machine that promised to save the health and beauty of women. The ad featured an illustration of a lovely young woman, perfectly dressed and coiffed, standing next to a washing machine with one hand delicately resting on it. The implication was clear. Use this machine and you too can remain young and beautiful, instead of being aged and damaged by laundry work. But the reality, as we have seen, was that the machines of this era did not actually save women from the physical toll of laundry. They might shift which muscles were being used, crank turning instead of scrubbing, but the work was still exhausting. And the machines did nothing to address the need to haul water, heat water, hang clothes to dry, or do the ironing. All of that remained exactly as difficult as it had always been. Let me tell you about an innovation that actually did help, at least somewhat. The wringer, which we discussed earlier, was one of the most successful early laundry devices. By the early 1900s, many washing machines came with wringers attached. You would wash the clothes using whatever agitation method the machine employed, then feed them through the wringer to squeeze out water before rinsing. This combination of washing machine plus wringer did save some labour and time, but it also cost more money. A machine with an attached wringer might cost $40 or $50, which was well beyond the reach of most families. And remember, even in 1920, only 8% of American families owned a washing machine. 8%. That means 92% of families were still washing by hand, still scrubbing on washboards, still doing all the brutal labour we have been discussing. Why was adoption so slow? Money is part of the answer. But there is another factor we need to consider. Many of these early machines were poorly made. They broke easily. Parts were hard to replace. If you lived in a rural area, getting a machine repaired might mean waiting weeks for a part to arrive or for someone with the necessary skills to come fix it. In the meantime, you were back to the washboard anyway. There is a diary entry from a woman in rural Kansas in 1905. She wrote, "The washing machine my husband bought last year is broken again. This is the third time. I am beginning to think it costs us more in repairs than it saves in labour. I told Henry we should have saved the money and I would just keep using the board. But men do love their mechanical contraptions, even when they do not work." I appreciate her brutal humour there, but underneath is real frustration. The promise of technology that does not deliver. The waste of hard-earned money on something that breaks constantly. The feeling of being sold a false hope. Now let us talk about who benefited from these early washing machines when they did work. Wealthy families could afford to buy them for their servants. Think about that for a moment. A wealthy family spends $30 or $40 on a washing machine, not for the wife of the house who does not do laundry anyway, but for the servant who does. The servant's labour becomes slightly less brutal perhaps, but she is still doing all the washing. The machine does not liberate her from the job, it just makes her slightly more efficient at it. And here is a dark irony. When washing machines did start to become more common in middle-class homes in the 1910s and 1920s, they were often marketed as a way to avoid having to hire a servant. "You do not need a laundress anymore," the advertisements implied. "You have an electrical servant instead." But of course, the woman of the house still had to operate the machine, load it, unload it, hang the clothes, do the ironing. The machine did not eliminate the work, it just changed who was expected to do it. Instead of paying a poor woman to wash your clothes, you bought a machine and did it yourself. This was framed as liberation, but was it? Or was it just a transfer of labour from one woman to another, with a machine company profiting from the transaction? Let me introduce you to one more woman before we leave this topic. Her name is Dorothy Chen, daughter of Esther Chen, whom we met during the soap-making discussion. Dorothy is living in San Francisco in 1918, helping her aging mother run the laundry business. By 1918, some commercial laundries have begun to use powered washing machines, large industrial versions that run on steam or early electric motors. Dorothy desperately wants one of these machines for their laundry business. She has done the calculations. A powered machine could wash more clothes in less time, which would mean they could take on more clients, which would mean more income. But the machines cost hundreds of dollars. Hundreds. The family cannot possibly afford it, especially not with the anti-Chinese sentiment and legal restrictions that limit what businesses Chinese immigrants can operate. So Dorothy and her mother continue to wash by hand. They continue to sacrifice their health and bodies while wealthier laundries, owned by white businessmen, invest in machinery that gives them a competitive advantage. The technology that is supposed to help everyone actually widens the gap between those who can afford it and those who cannot. There is a bitter irony in the fact that the women who most desperately needed labour-saving devices were the women least able to afford them. The professional laundresses, the domestic servants, the poor housewives washing for large families, they were the ones whose bodies were being destroyed by laundry work. But they were also the ones for whom a $25 washing machine was an impossible luxury. As we think about these early washing machines, I want us to resist the temptation to see them as a simple story of progress. Yes, technology was advancing. Yes, inventors were trying to solve a real problem. But the benefits of that technology were unevenly distributed. Wealth determined who got relief from brutal labor and who continued to suffer. And even for women who did get access to these early machines, the reality often fell short of the promise. The machines broke. They were awkward to use. They still required enormous amounts of work. The fundamental problems of laundry, the need for water and heat and hanging space and ironing time remained unsolved. But change was coming, real change. Because by the 1920s, two things were beginning to transform American homes in fundamental ways: electricity and running water. These utilities, these basic infrastructures, would prove more revolutionary than any washing machine design. Because once you had water flowing from a tap and power flowing through wires, then and only then could washing machines truly transform laundry work. That transformation, that moment when technology finally began to deliver on its promises, is where we turn next. To the commercial laundries that offered a glimpse of freedom, and to the slow, uneven arrival of the conveniences that would eventually change everything. Freedom, real freedom, not the false promise of a hand-crank washing machine that still required hours of labor. Not the partial relief of a wringer that saved your hands, but not your back. I am talking about the freedom to hand a bag of dirty laundry to someone else on Monday morning and receive it back on Friday, clean and pressed and ready to wear, without having spent a single hour scrubbing or boiling or wringing. This freedom existed, but only for some people, only in certain places, and only for a brief golden moment before it vanished and was replaced by something else entirely. Transport yourself to a street corner in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, on a spring morning in Nub 2. A young woman named Clara Hoffman is walking to work. In her hand she carries a numbered ticket, the kind you might get at a coat check. But this ticket is not for a coat. It is for laundry. Clara drops her family's dirty clothes off at the commercial steam laundry every Monday, on her way to her job at a department store. On Friday she picks them up, clean and folded, pays her 75 cents and takes them home. 75 cents per week for someone else to do all the washing. Think about what this means for Clara. Monday is no longer a day of dread. She does not wake at dawn to haul water. She does not spend hours bent over a washboard. She does not risk burns from boiling water or exhaustion from wringing of sheets. She simply drops off her bag and walks away. For 75 cents, she has purchased back her Monday. She has bought time, energy, and health. But let us be clear about what 75 cents meant in 1902. Clara works 6 days a week at the department store and earns about $7 per week. So she is spending roughly 10% of her income on laundry service. That is a significant expense. But Clara has done the calculation. The time she saves by not doing laundry allows her to take in mending work on Monday evenings, which earns her an extra $1 per week. So the commercial laundry is not just a convenience. It is an economic strategy that actually increases her income. Now let me take you inside one of these commercial steam laundries to see what is happening to Clara's clothes. The facility is a large industrial space. The air is hot and humid, filled with the hiss of steam and the rumble of machinery. Women work here, dozens of them, but the work is different from home laundry in significant ways. First, there is scale. These laundries process hundreds of pounds of clothing per day. They have large washing machines powered by steam engines. These machines can handle loads that would be impossible to wash by hand. The efficiency is remarkable. What would take one woman an entire day to wash at home can be washed here in an hour or two by a team working with machines. Second, there is specialization. In a commercial laundry, different women do different tasks. Some operate the washing machines. Others work the mangles, which are large rollers that press sheets and tablecloths. Others do hand ironing of shirts and dresses. Still others sort and fold. This division of labour makes the process faster and, in theory, less exhausting for any individual worker, because she is not doing every step of the process. But let me introduce you to one of those workers so we can understand what this work was actually like. Her name is Rose Kowalczyk, and she is a Polish immigrant working in a steam laundry in Chicago in 1905. Rose's job is operating one of the washing machines. She stands at this machine for 10 hours a day, loading dirty laundry, adding soap, starting the machine, unloading clean laundry, and repeating the process over and over. The temperature in the washing room regularly exceeds 100 degrees Fahrenheit because of the steam from the machines. Rose is soaked with sweat within an hour of starting her shift. The noise is incredible, a constant roar of machinery that makes conversation impossible and leaves her ears ringing at the end of the day. And the pace is relentless. The laundry must be processed quickly to meet customer deadlines, so there is no time for rest. No time to slow down. Rose earns $6 per week for this work. 6 days a week, 10 hours a day in conditions that are honestly quite brutal. But she takes the job because it pays better than domestic service and because when her shift ends, she can leave. She has her evenings and her Sundays. She has a life outside of work in a way that live-in servants never could. And here is something remarkable. Rose and the other laundry workers organised. In 1900, laundry workers in Troy, New York went on strike for better wages and shorter hours. In 1909, workers in several cities organised unions and demanded safer working conditions. These were women, mostly immigrants, many speaking little English, but they understood their worth and they fought for their rights. These strikes were not always successful. Laundry owners could hire replacement workers easily because there were always desperate women who needed jobs. But the strikes happened. Women stood up. They said, "This work is valuable and we deserve better treatment." That matters. That resistance matters. Now let us talk about the different types of commercial laundries because they serve different markets and operated differently. Steam laundries, like the one where Rose worked, served middle-class and working-class customers. They offered affordable utilitarian service. Your clothes came back clean but not necessarily pristine. Then there were hand laundries, often run by Chinese immigrants, that offered more careful, detailed work. These laundries specialized in shirts and collars that required precise ironing. The work was done largely by hand with great attention to detail, but it was also more expensive. A hand laundry might charge 15 cents to wash and iron a single shirt, while a steam laundry might charge 10 cents. And finally, there were luxury laundries that served wealthy clients. These establishments offered pick-up and delivery service, handled delicate fabrics with extreme care, and charged accordingly. A wealthy woman could have her laundry picked up from her home, processed with individual attention, and returned without her ever having to think about it beyond paying the bill. But here is what is fascinating. The existence of commercial laundries created a brief period, roughly from the 1890s through the 1920s, when many middle-class women were freed from laundry work. They could afford to send at least some of their laundry out. Their Mondays were different from their mothers' Mondays. They had time for other things: education, social reform work, suffrage organising, artistic pursuits. There is a wonderful quote from a women's magazine in 1910. A writer described the commercial laundry as the modern woman's emancipator and said that sending out the wash had done more to improve women's lives than almost any other innovation. She wrote, The woman who once spent Monday bent over a wash tub now spends Monday at a club meeting or a lecture or in her garden. The laundry has given her back her life. But here is the question we must ask. Whose life was given back? The middle-class woman who could afford 75 cents per week? Yes, but what about Rose, sweating in the steam laundry? What about the Chinese immigrant spending 14 hours a day hand-ironing shirts in a poorly ventilated shop? Their labour made the middle-class woman's freedom possible. The work did not disappear, it was just redistributed. Now let us talk about what happened next, because the era of commercial laundries as the primary solution to the laundry problem was relatively brief. Two major changes were coming that would transform everything: the spread of electricity and the spread of indoor plumbing. Let me take you to a small town in rural Indiana in 1925. A woman named Edith Morrison has just had electricity installed in her home. This is a big event. Her town only got electrical service 2 years ago, and her family saved for months to afford the wiring. Now Edith has electric lights. She has an electric iron that heats itself instead of needing to be heated on the stove, and she is looking at advertisements for electric washing machines. These new electric machines are different from the hand crank machines we discussed earlier. They agitate the clothes automatically. You do not have to provide the power with your own muscles. You fill the machine, add soap, turn it on, and the motor does the work. It is finally the promise that earlier machines failed to deliver. But these machines are expensive. A basic electric washing machine in 1925 costs about $150. That is more than 2 months' wages for many families. Edith cannot afford it. Not yet. But she is saving. She's putting aside $1 here, $2 there, dreaming of the day when she can buy one. And here is the other crucial element: running water. In 1925, Edith still hauls water from a pump in her yard. Even if she had an electric washing machine, she would still have to fill it bucket by bucket. The machine would save her the physical labour of agitation, but not the labour of hauling water. But in cities, things are changing faster. Urban areas are installing water systems. Pipes are bringing water directly into homes. By 1920, most urban American homes have indoor plumbing. A woman in New York or Chicago or San Francisco can turn a tap and have water. Hot water even if her building has a boiler system. Think about what this means. Think about how fundamentally this changes laundry work. No more hauling, no more heating water over a fire. You turn a tap and hot water flows. You connect a hose to your washing machine and it fills automatically. The two most exhausting parts of laundry work, hauling water and heating it, are suddenly eliminated for women lucky enough to have these utilities. But here is the bitter reality. Rural areas lagged far behind cities in getting these services. A woman in rural Kentucky in 1930 might still be hauling water from a well and heating it over a wood stove, doing laundry exactly the way her grandmother had done it 50 years earlier. Meanwhile, a woman in an urban apartment building might have an electric washing machine and hot running water. The gap between rural and urban women's experiences was enormous. There is a letter from 1928 written by a farm woman in Nebraska to a women's magazine. She described visiting her sister in Omaha and being astounded by the conveniences. Her sister had hot water from a tap. She had an electric washing machine. She could do a week's worth of laundry in a few hours with minimal physical effort. The farm woman wrote, "I returned home and looked at my pump and my washboard and I wept, not from self-pity, but from the sheer exhaustion of knowing I must continue this way for years more, while my sister lives in such ease, just 100 miles away." That geographic inequality is something we need to sit with for a moment. Progress was not evenly distributed across space. It clustered in cities and wealthy suburbs. Rural women, Poor women. Women in isolated areas. They continued to wash by hand for decades after urban women had machines and running water. The gap created by wealth was compounded by the gap created by geography. And let us not forget the racial dimension. Black families in the South, living under Jim Crow segregation, often had no access to commercial laundries that would serve them. They could not afford electric washing machines even when electricity reached their communities. Black women continued to wash by hand or to work as laundresses for white families well into the mid-20th century. As we near the end of this part of our journey, I want you to picture two women, both living in America in 1925. One is in an apartment in Boston with hot running water and an electric washing machine. Her Monday is radically different from what it would have been 25 years earlier. She has been liberated in a real and meaningful way. The other woman is on a farm in Arkansas. She hauls water from a well. She scrubs on a washboard. She boils clothes over a wood fire. Her Monday is identical to what it would have been in 1900 or 1880, or even earlier. For her, nothing has changed. The promises of progress have not reached her yet, and she has no idea when or if they ever will. These two women exist simultaneously in the same country, in the same moment in history, and that tells us something important about progress. It is not a tide that lifts all boats equally. It is uneven, unfair, and shaped by forces of economics and geography and race that determine who benefits and who continues to struggle. But we are not quite finished with this story. Because even for the women who did get access to modern conveniences, even for those who finally had washing machines and running water, there is one more chapter to tell. The chapter about what all of this cost, not in money, though we have talked about that, but in time, in health, in dreams deferred, in the price that women paid with their bodies and their futures. That final reckoning is where we close our journey. There is a photograph I want you to imagine. It does not exist because nobody thought to take it, but it should have been taken. It would show the hands of a woman who has spent 50 years doing laundry. Every Monday, every Thursday, sometimes more often than that. 50 years of hauling water and scrubbing on washboards and wringing heavy fabric and plunging hands into caustic soap. What would those hands look like? The knuckles would be swollen with arthritis. The skin would be scarred and rough, marked by burns and cuts that never quite healed properly. The fingers might not straighten completely anymore. These hands would tell a story that nobody wanted to hear, a story about the true cost of clean clothes. Let me tell you about a woman named Anna Bergström. She was born in Sweden in 1845 and immigrated to Minnesota in 1868 at the age of 23. She married a farmer, had 6 children, and lived until 25, dying just 2 months before her 80th birthday. We know these basic facts from census records and a gravestone, but what we know from her granddaughter's memoir is more revealing. Anna's granddaughter wrote that her grandmother's back was so curved from years of bending over washtubs that she could no longer stand fully upright in her later years. She wrote that Anna's hands were gnarled and painful, that simple tasks like buttoning a dress or holding a cup became difficult. She wrote that Anna often spoke about how much of her life had been consumed by laundry, how many hours she had spent in service to cleanliness, hours she could never reclaim. The granddaughter calculated, based on Anna's own estimates, that her grandmother had spent approximately 104 days per year, every year, on laundry-related tasks. That is nearly 1/3 of her adult life. Multiply that by the 57 years Anna was married and managing a household, and you get over 5,900 days spent washing clothes. That is more than 16 years of her life if you added up every hour spent on laundry work. 16 years. Think about that. 16 years of Anna's life gone. Not spent on things she chose, not invested in pursuits she valued, but consumed by the necessity of keeping her family in clean clothes. What books might she have read? What skills might she have learned? What contributions might she have made to her community if she had had those 16 years back? We will never know, and Anna is just one woman. Multiply her story by millions, by every woman who washed clothes before machines and running water became common, and you begin to grasp the magnitude of what was lost. But let us talk about more than just time, because the cost was not only measured in hours. Let me share some medical statistics that are genuinely shocking. A study conducted in the 20s examined the health records of women who had done manual laundry work for most of their lives compared to women who had not. The findings were stark. Women who had done regular manual laundry had significantly higher rates of chronic back pain, arthritis in the hands and wrists, and respiratory problems from years of inhaling steam and fumes. Their life expectancy was several years shorter than women who had not done this work regularly. Several years. Laundry work, quite literally, shortened lives. And we have not even talked about the psychological toll. There is a concept in psychology called learned helplessness, where people who face overwhelming, unchangeable circumstances eventually stop trying to change them. They accept their suffering as inevitable. Many women experienced this with laundry work. Monday came, and it would always come, and there was nothing to be done about it except endure. I found a diary entry from a woman in rural Virginia in 1912. She wrote, "Another Monday, another wash day. I am 42 years old and I have been doing this since I was 14. 28 years of Mondays. I will do this until I die, or until I am too broken to continue. There is no escape. This is my life." The despair in those words is palpable, and what makes it more heartbreaking is that she was writing this in 1912, when washing machines existed, when some women already had them, when the technology for liberation was available but out of her reach because of economics and geography and pure bad luck. But I do not want to end our journey on despair, because there is another side to this story, the side about resilience, about women finding ways to survive impossible circumstances, about communities of women supporting each other, about small acts of resistance and moments of joy stolen from the grinding routine. Let me tell you about laundry songs. In many communities, particularly among black women in the South, laundry work was accompanied by singing. These were not just random songs. They were work songs with rhythms that matched the scrubbing motion or the stirring of boiling pots. The songs served multiple purposes. They made the time pass faster, they created a sense of solidarity, and they were beautiful. One such song that was recorded in the 1930s goes, "Scrub, scrub, scrub all day long, scrub, 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 sing this song, when my work is finally done, I will rest beneath the sun." The lyrics are simple, but the act of singing them while working was an act of claiming humanity in the midst of dehumanizing labor. It said, "I am more than this work. I have a voice. I have a soul." Women also found small ways to make the work more bearable. They would do laundry together when possible, turning a solitary task into a social occasion. They would share tips and techniques, helping each other become more efficient. They would watch each other's children so one woman could focus on the work while another kept the little ones safe, and women organized. We talked about the Atlanta laundry workers' strike, but there were many other instances of women demanding better. Domestic workers formed associations, laundresses created informal networks to set prices and standards. Women wrote letters to newspapers and magazines demanding recognition of their labor. These acts of resistance were not always successful in material terms, but they were successful in spiritual terms. They said, "Our work has value. We have worth. We will not be invisible." And that matters enormously. Now, As we come to the end of this long journey through the history of laundry, I want us to reflect on what this story teaches us. It teaches us, first, that women's work has always been undervalued. The labour that kept families fed and clothed and clean, the labour without which society could not function, was considered less important than men's paid labour. It was invisible, taken for granted, unpaid or underpaid. Second, it teaches us that technological progress is not inevitable and not evenly distributed. Washing machines existed for decades before most women had access to them. The benefits of electricity and running water reached some communities generations before others. Who benefited from progress was determined by wealth, geography, and race. Third, it teaches us about the hidden costs of how we lived in the past. When we romanticize the good old days, or imagine that life was simpler and better before modern technology, we forget stories like these. We forget the women whose bodies were broken, whose time was stolen, whose potential was never realized because they spent 16 years of their lives washing clothes. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us about resilience and resistance, about women who survived impossible circumstances, about communities that supported each other, about people who fought for dignity and justice even when the odds were stacked against them. When you do laundry next, when you press that button and walk away, I want you to remember Sarah hauling water in the dark before dawn. Remember Ruth scrubbing on a washboard until her hands bled. Remember Luella standing over a pot of boiling water in the summer heat. Remember all the women whose labour, whose suffering, whose lost time and damaged bodies made it possible for laundry to eventually become the simple, easy task it is for many of us today. Their work mattered, their struggle mattered, their resistance mattered, and their stories deserve to be remembered, not forgotten. We have spent these hours together exploring one aspect of women's lives in the past, the aspect of housework, specifically laundry. But this is just one thread in a much larger tapestry of women's history. There are so many other stories to tell, stories of women's education, women's fight for suffrage, women's experiences in different cultures and time periods, stories of joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy, resistance and resilience. I hope you will join me for those stories. I hope you will continue this journey of discovering the lives of women who came before us, whose experiences shape the world we live in today, whose struggles and victories echo through generations. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening to these stories, for caring about these women, for taking the time to understand a part of history that is often overlooked. Your attention, your empathy, your willingness to learn, these things matter. They keep these stories alive. They honor the women who lived them. Before you go, before you drift off to sleep, take a moment to think about the women in your own life. Your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother. What stories did they live that you do not know? What labor did they perform that went unrecognized? What dreams did they defer? And what strength did they show in the face of circumstances that would have broken many of us? Their stories are worth discovering. Their lives are worth honoring. And I hope that what we have explored tonight inspires you to ask questions, to listen to stories, to preserve memories before they are lost. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the simple act of falling asleep in clean sheets is a luxury that countless women work themselves to exhaustion to provide. And when you wake up, when you go about your daily tasks, remember that much of what we take for granted was hard won by those who came before us. I will be back soon with more stories from the past, more journeys into the lives of people whose experiences can teach us about ourselves and our world. Until then, rest easy, dream gently, and remember the women who hauled water in the dark so that we might have it easier. Good night.